be they large or small. The initial assemblies and the movement that seeks to foster them in civic elections remain the only real schools for citizenship we have. There is no civic curriculum other than a living and creative political realm that can give rise to people who take management of public affairs seriously. What we must clearly do in an era of commodification, rivalry, anomie, and egoism is to consciously create a public sphere that will inculcate the values of humanism, cooperation, community, and public service in the everyday practice of civic life. Grassroots citizenship goes hand in hand with grassroots politics. The Athenian polis, for all its many shortcomings, offers us remarkable examples of how a high sense of citizenship can be reinforced not only by systematic education, but by an etiquette of civic behavior and an artistic culture that adorns ideals of civic service with the realities of civic practice. Deference to opponents in debates, the use of language to achieve consensus, ongoing public discussion in the agora, in which even the most prominent of the polis's figures were expected to debate public issues with the least known, the use of wealth not only to meet personal needs, but to adorn the polis itself, thus placing a high premium on the disaccumulation rather than the accumulation of wealth. A multitude of public festivals, dramas, and satires largely centered on civic affairs and the need to foster civic solidarity. All of these and many other aspects of Athens' political culture created the civic solidarity and responsibility that made for actively involved citizens with a deep sense of civic mission. For our part, we can do no less, and hopefully, in time, considerably more. The development of citizenship must become an art, not merely an education, and a creative art in the aesthetic sense that appeals to the deeply human desire for self-expression in a meaningful political community. It must be a personal art in which every citizen is fully aware of the fact that his or her community entrusts its destiny to his or her moral probity and rationality. If the ideological authority of state power and statecraft today rests on the assumption that the citizen is an incompetent being, the municipalist conception of citizenship rests on precisely the opposite. Every citizen will be regarded as competent to participate directly in the affairs of state. Indeed, it is more important he or she would be encouraged to do so. Every means would be provided, whether aesthetic or institutional, to foster participation in full, as an educative and ethical process that turns the citizen's latent competence into an actual reality. Social and political life would be consciously orchestrated to foster a profound sensitivity, indeed an active sense of concern for the adjudications of differences without denying the need for vigorous dispute when it is needed. Public service would be seen as a uniquely human attribute, not a gift that the citizen confers on the community or an onerous task that he or she must fulfill. Cooperation and civic responsibility would become expressions of acts of sociability and philia, not ordinances that the citizen is expected to honour in the breach and evade where he or she can do so. Put bluntly and clearly, the municipality would become a theatre in which life in its most meaningful public form is the plot, a political drama whose grandeur imparts nobility and grandeur to the citizenry that forms the caste. By contrast, our modern cities have become, in large part, agglomerations of bedroom apartments in which men and women spiritually wither away and their personalities become trivialized by the petty concerns of amusement, consumption, and small talk. The last and one of the most intractable problems we must face is economic. Today, economic issues tend to center on who owns what, who owns more than whom, and above all, how disparities in wealth are to be reconciled with a sense of civic commonality. Nearly all municipalities have been fragmented by differences in economic status, pitting poor, middle, and wealthy classes against each other, often to ruin the municipal freedom itself, as the bloody history of Italy's medieval and Renaissance cities so clearly demonstrates. These problems have not disappeared in recent times. Indeed, in many cases, they are as severe as they have ever been. But what is unique about our time, a fact so little understood by many liberals and radicals in North America and Europe, is that entirely new trans-class issues have emerged to concern environment, growth, transportation, cultural degradation, and the quality of urban life generally. Issues that have been produced by urbanization, not by citification. Cutting across conflicting class interests are such trans-class issues as the massive dangers of thermonuclear war, growing state authoritarianism, and ultimately global ecological breakdown. To an extent unparalleled in American history, an enormous variety of citizens' groups have brought people of all class backgrounds into common projects around problems, often very local in character, that concern the destiny and welfare of their community as a whole. Issues such as the siting of nuclear reactors or nuclear waste dumps, the dangers of acid rain, and the presence of toxic dumps, to cite only a few of the many problems that beleaguer innumerable American and British municipalities, have united an astonishing variety of people into movements that share concerns that render a ritualistic class analysis of their motives a matter of secondary importance. Carried still further, their absorption of small communities by larger ones, of cities by urban belts, and urban belts by standard metropolitan statistical areas, or conurbations, has given rise to militant demands for communal integrity and self-government, an issue that surmounts strictly class and economic interests. The literature on the emergence of these trans-class movements, so secondary to internecine struggles within cities of earlier times, is so immense that to merely list the sources would require a sizable volume. I have given this brief overview of an emerging general social interest over old particularistic interests to demonstrate that a new politics could easily come into being. Indeed, one that would be concerned not only with restructuring the political landscape on a municipal level, but the economic landscape as well. The old debates between private property and nationalized property are becoming threadbare. Not that these different kinds of ownership and the forms of exploitation they imply have disappeared. Rather, that they are being increasingly overshadowed by new realities and concerns. Private property, in the traditional sense, with its case for perpetuating the citizen as an economically self-sufficient and politically self-empowered individual, is fading away. It is disappearing not because so-called creeping socialism is devouring so-called free enterprise, but because creeping corporatism is devouring everyone. ironically in the name of so-called free enterprise. The Greek ideal of the politically sovereign citizen who can make a rational judgment in public affairs because he is free from material need or clientage has been reduced to a mockery. The oligarchical character of economic life threatens democracy such as it is, not only on a national level, but also on a municipal level, where it still preserves a certain degree of intimacy and leeway. We come here to a breakthrough approach to a municipalist economics that innovatively dissolves the mystical aura surrounding corporatized property and nationalized property. Indeed, workplace elitism and workplace democracy. I refer to the municipalization of property, as opposed to its corporatization or its nationalization. Libertarian municipalism proposes that land and enterprises be placed increasingly in the custody of the community. More precisely, the custody of citizens in free assemblies and their deputies in confederal councils. In such a municipal economy, confederal, interdependent and rational by ecological, not simply technological standards, we would expect that the special interests that divide people today into workers, professionals, managers and the like would be melded into a general interest in which people see themselves as citizens, guided strictly by the needs of their community and region rather than by personal proclivities and vocational concerns. Here, citizenship would come into its own, and rational as well as ecological interpretations of the public good would supplant class and hierarchical interests. As for the workplace, public democracy would be substituted for the traditional images of productive management and operation, so-called economic democracy, and so-called economic collectivization. Significantly, economic democracy in the workplace is no longer incompatible with a corporatized or nationalized economy. Quite to the contrary, the effective use of workers' participation in production, even the outright handing over of industrial operations to the workers who perform them, has become another form of time-studied assembly line rationalization, another systematic abuse of labor by bringing labor itself into complicity with its own exploitation. Many workers, in fact, would like to get away from their workplaces and find more creative types of work, not simply participate in planning their own misery. What economic democracy meant in its profoundest sense was free, democratic access to the means of life, the guarantee of freedom from material want, not simply the involvement of workers in onerous, productive activities that could be better turned over to machines. It is a blatant bourgeois trick in which many radicals unknowingly participate, that economic democracy has been reinterpreted to mean employee ownership, or that workplace democracy has come to mean workers' participation in an industrial management, rather than freedom from the tyranny of the factory, rationalized labor, and planned production. A municipal politics based on communalist principles scores a significant advance over all these conceptions by calling for the municipalization of the economy and its management by the community as part of a politics of self-management. Syndicalist demands for the collectivization of industry and workers' control of individual industrial units are based on contractual and exchange relationships between all collectivized enterprises, thereby indirectly re-privatizing the economy and opening it to traditional forms of private property, even if each enterprise is collectively owned. By contrast, libertarian municipalism literally politicizes the economy by dissolving economic decision-making into the civic domain. Neither factory nor land becomes a separate or potentially competitive unit within a seemingly communal collective. Nor do workers, farmers, technicians, engineers, professionals, and the like perpetuate their vocational identities as separate interests that exist apart from the citizen body in face-to-face assemblies. Property is integrated into the municipality as the material component of a civic framework. Indeed, as a part of a larger whole that is controlled by the citizen body in assembly as citizens, not as workers, farmers, professionals, or any other vocationally oriented special interest groups. What is equally important, the famous contradiction or antagonism between town and country, so crucial in social theory and history, is transcended by the township, the traditional New England jurisdiction, in which an urban entity is the nucleus of its agricultural and village environs, not a domineering urban entity that stands opposed to them. A township, in effect, is a small region within still larger ones, such as the county and larger political jurisdictions. So conceived, the municipalization of the economy should be distinguished not only from corporatization, but also from seemingly more radical demands such as nationalization and collectivization. Nationalization of the economy invariably has led to bureaucratic and top-down economic control. Collectivization, in turn, could easily lead to a privatized economy in a collectivized form with the perpetuation of class or caste identities. By contrast, municipalization would bring the economy as a whole into the orbit of the public sphere, where economic policy could be formulated by the entire community. Notably, its citizens in face-to-face relationships working to achieve a greater interest that surmounts separate, vocationally defined specific interests. The economy would cease to be merely an economy in the conventional sense of the term, composed of capitalistic, nationalized, or so-called worker-controlled enterprises. It would become the economy of the polis or the municipality. The municipality, more precisely, the citizen body in face-to-face assembly. The municipality, more precisely, the citizen body in face-to-face assembly, would absorb the economy into its public business, divesting it of a separate identity that can become privatized into a self-serving enterprise. The municipalization of the economy would not only absorb the vocational differences that could militate against a publicly controlled economy, it would also absorb the material means of life into communal forms of distribution. From each according to his ability to each according to his needs, the famous demand of various 19th century socialisms would be institutionalized as a part of the public sphere. The traditional maxim, which is meant to assure that people have access to the means of life, irrespective of the work they are capable of performing, would cease to be merely a precarious credo. It would become a practice, a way of functioning politically, one that is structurally built into the community as a way of existing as a political entity. Moreover, the enormous growth of the productive forces, rationally and ecologically employed for social rather than private ends, has rendered the age-old problem of material scarcity a moot issue. Potentially, all the basic means for living in comfort and security are available to the populations of the world, notwithstanding the dire and often fallacious claims of present-day misanthropes and anti-humanists such as Garrett Hardin, Paul Ehrlich, and regrettably, advocates of so-called simple living, who can barely be parted from their computers even as they deride technological developments of almost any kind. It is easily forgotten that only a few generations ago, famine was no less a plague than deadly infectious diseases like the Black Death, and that the lifespan of most people at the turn of the last century in the United States and Europe seldom reached 50 years of age. No community can hope to achieve economic autarky, nor should it try to do so. Economically, the wide range of resources that are needed to make many of our widely used goods preclude self-enclosed insularity and parochialism. Far from being a liability, this interdependence among communities and regions can well be regarded as an asset, culturally as well as politically. Interdependence among communities is no less important than interdependence among individuals. Divested of the cultural cross-fertilization that is often the product of economic intercourse, the municipality tends to shrink into itself and disappear into its own civic privatism. Shared needs and resources imply the existence of sharing, and with sharing, communication, rejuvenation by new ideas, and a wider social horizon that yields a wider sensibility to new experiences. The recent emphasis in environmental theory on self-sufficiency, if it does not mean a greater degree of prudence in dealing with material resources, is regressive. Localism should never be interpreted to mean parochialism, nor should decentralism ever be interpreted to mean that smallness is a virtue in itself. Small is not necessarily beautiful. The concept of human scale, by far the most preferable expression for a truly ecological policy, is meant to make it possible for people to completely grasp their political environment, not to parochially bury themselves in it to the exclusion of cultural stimuli from outside their community's boundaries. Given these coordinates, it is possible to envision a new political culture with a new revival of citizenship, popular civic institutions, a new kind of economy, and a countervailing dual power, confederally networked, that could arrest and hopefully reverse the growing centralization of the state and corporate enterprises. Moreover, it is also possible to envision an eminently practical point of departure for going beyond the town and city as we have known them up to now, and for developing future forms of habitations as communities that seek to achieve new harmonization between people and between humanity and the natural world. I have emphasized its practicality because it is now clear that any attempt to tailor a human community to a natural ecosystem in which it is located cuts completely against the grain of centralized power, be it state or corporate. Centralized power invariably reproduces itself in centralized forms at all levels of social, political, and economic life. It not only is big, it thinks big. Indeed, this way of being and thinking is a condition for its survival, not only its growth. As for the technological basis for decentralized communities, we are now witnessing a revolution that would have seemed hopelessly utopian only a few decades ago. Until recently, smaller scale eco-technologies were used mainly by individuals, and their efficiency barely compared with that of conventional energy sources, such as fossil fuels and nuclear power plants. The situation has changed dramatically in the past 15 to 20 years. In the United States, wind turbines have been developed and are currently in use that generates electric power at a cost of 7 to 9 cents per kilowatt hour, compared with 20 cents only a decade earlier. This figure is very close to the 4 to 6 cent cost of power plants fueled by natural gas or coal. These comparisons, which can be expected to improve in favor of wind power in the years to come, have fostered the expansion of this non-fossil fuel source throughout the entire world, particularly in India, where there has been a major wind boom in 1994, according to the World Watch Institute. A similar boom seems to be in the making in a variety of solar power devices. New solar collectors have been designed that increasingly approximate the costs of conventional energy sources, particularly in heating water for domestic uses. Photovoltaic cells, in which silicon is used to convert solar energy into electrons, have been developed to a point where thousands of villages in the developing world are using photovoltaic cells to power lights, televisions, and water pumps, needs that are otherwise met with kerosene lamps, lead-acid batteries, or diesel engines. In fact, more than 200,000 homes in Mexico, Indonesia, South Africa, and some 2,000 in the Dominican Republic have been solarized, probably with a good many more to come. It can be said with reasonable confidence that this increasingly sophisticated technology will become one of the most important, if not the most important, sources of electrical energy in the years to come, yet one that is eminently suitable for humanly scaled communities. To view technological advances as intrinsically harmful, particularly non-polluting sources of energy and automated machinery that can free human beings of mindless toil in a rational society, is as short-sighted as it is arrogant. Understandably, people today will not accept the diet of pious moral platitudes that call for simple means that presumably will give them rich ends, whatever these may be, especially if these platitudes are delivered by well-paid academics and privileged Euro-Americans who have no serious quarrel with the present social order, apart from whether it affords them access to so-called wilderness theme parks. For the majority of humanity, toil and needless shortages of food are an everyday reality. To expect them to become active citizens in a vital political, ecologically oriented community while engaging in arduous work for most of their lives, often on empty bellies, is an unfeeling middle-class presumption. Unless they can enjoy a decent sufficiency in the means of life and freedom from mindless, often involuntary toil, it is the height of arrogance to degrade their humanity by calling them mouths, as many demographers do, or consumers, as certain very comfortable environmentalists do. Indeed, it is the height of elitism and privilege to deny them the opportunity and the means for choosing the kind of lifeways they want to pursue. Nor have the well-to-do strata of Euro-American society deprived themselves of that very freedom of choice, a choice, in fact, that they take for granted as a matter of course. Without fostering promising advances in technology that can free humanity as a whole from its subservience to the present, irrational, and let me emphasize, anti-ecological social order, we will almost certainly never achieve the free society whose existence is a precondition for harmony between human and human, and between humanity and the natural world. Which is not to say that we can ignore the need for a visionary ethical ideal. Ironically, it has been the right's shrewd emphasis on ethics and matters of spirit in an increasingly meaningless world that has given it a considerable edge over the forces of progress. Nazism achieved much of its success among the German people a half-century ago, not because of any economic panaceas it offered, but because of its mythic ideal of nationhood, community, and moral regeneration. In recent times, reactionary movements in America have won millions to their cause on such values as the integrity of the family, religious belief, the renewal of patriotism, and the right to life. A message, I may add, that has been construed not only as a justification for anti-abortion legislation, but as a hypostatization of the individual's sacredness, unborn as well as born. Characteristically, liberal and radical causes are still mired in exclusively economistic and productivistic approaches to political issues. Their moral message, once a heightened plea for social justice, has given way increasingly to strictly material demands. Far more than the right, which practices egoism and class war against the poor, even as it emphasizes community virtues, the political middle ground and the left take up the eminently practical issue of bread on the table and money in the bank, but offer few values that are socially inspirational. Having emphasized the need to resolve the problems of material scarcity, it is equally necessary to emphasize the need to address the moral emptiness that a market society produces among large numbers of people today. Morality and ethics, let me add, cannot be reduced to mere rhetoric to match the claims of reactionaries, but must be the felt spiritual underpinnings of a new social outlook. They must be viewed not as a patronizing sermon, but as a living practice that people can incorporate into their personal lives and their communities. The vacuity and triviality of life today must be replaced precisely by radical ideals of solidarity and freedom that sustain the human side of life as well as its material side, or else the ideals by which a rational future should be guided will disappear in the commodity-oriented world we call the marketplace of ideas. The most indecent aspect of this so-called marketplace is that ideals tend to become artifacts, mere commodities, that lack even the value of the material things we need to sustain us. They become the ideological ornaments to garnish an inherently anti-human and anti-ecological society, one that threatens to undermine moral integrity as such, and the simple social amenities that foster human intercourse. Thus, a municipal agenda that is meant to countervail urbanization and the nation-state must be more than a mere electoral platform, such as we expect from conventional parties. It must also be a message comparable to the great manifestos advanced by various socialist movements in the last century, which called for moral as well as material and institutional reconstruction. Today's electoral platforms, whether green or red, radical or liberal, are generally shopping lists of demands, precisely suited for that marketplace of ideas we have misnamed politics. Nor can a municipal agenda be a means for effacing serious differences in outlook. The need for thinking out ideas and struggling vigorously to give them coherence, which alone renders an agenda for new municipal politics intelligible, is often sacrificed to ideological confusion in the name of achieving a specious unity. A cranky pluralism is replacing an appreciation of focused thinking. A shallow relativism is replacing a sense of continuity and meaningful values. A confused eclecticism is replacing wholeness, clarity, and consistency. Many promising movements for basic social change in the recent past were plagued by a pluralism in which totally contradictory views were never worked out or followed to their logical conclusions. A problem that has grown even worse today due to the cultural illiteracy that plagues contemporary society. A serious political movement that seeks to advance a libertarian municipalist agenda, in turn, must be patient, just as the Russian populists of the last century were. The 1960s upsurge, with all its generous ideals, fell apart because young radicals demanded immediate gratification and sensational success. The protracted efforts that are so direly needed for building a serious movement, perhaps one whose goals cannot be realized within a single lifetime, are woefully absent. Many of the radicals of 30 years ago, burning with fervor for fundamental change, have since withdrawn into the university system they once denounced, the parliamentary positions they formerly disdained, and the business enterprises that they furiously attacked. A libertarian municipalist movement in particular would not and should not achieve sudden success and wide public accolades. The present period of political malaise at best and outright reaction at worst renders any sensational successes impossible. If such a libertarian municipalist movement runs candidates for municipal councils with demands for the institution of public assemblies, it will more likely lose electoral races today rather than win even slight successes. Depending upon the political climate at any given time or place, years may pass before it wins even the most modest success. In a very real sense, however, this protracted development is a desideratum. With rapid success, many naive members of a municipal electorate expect rapid changes, which no minority, however substantial, can ever hope to achieve at once. For an unpredictable amount of time, electoral activity will primarily be an educational activity, an endeavour to enter the public sphere, however small and contained it may be on the local level, and to educate and interact with ever larger numbers of people. Even where a measure of electoral success on a local level can be achieved, the prospect of implementing a radically democratic policy is likely to be obstructed by the opposition of the nation-state and the weak opposition of municipalities in modern democratic nation-states. Although it is highly doubtful that even civic authorities would allow a neighbourhood assembly to acquire the legal power to make civic policy, still less state and national authorities, let me emphasize that assemblies that have no legal power can exercise enormous moral power. A popular assembly that sternly voices its views on many issues can cause considerable disquiet among local authorities and generate a widespread public reaction in its favour over a large region, indeed even on a national scale. An interesting case in point is the nuclear freeze resolution that was adopted by more than 100 town meetings in Vermont a decade ago. Not only did this resolution resonate throughout the entire United States, leading to ad hoc town meetings in regions of the country that had never been seen, It affected national policy on this issue and culminated in a demonstration of approximately 1 million people in New York City. Yet none of the town meetings had the legal authority to enforce a nuclear freeze, nor did the issue fall within the purview of the typical New England town meetings agenda. Historically, in fact, few civic projects that resemble libertarian municipalism began with a view toward establishing a radical democracy of any sort. The 48 Parisian sections of 1793 actually derived from the 60 Parisian electoral districts of 1789. These districts were initially established through a complicated process deliberately designed to exclude the poorer people of Paris, to choose the Parisian members of the Third Estate when the king convoked the Estates General at Versailles. Thereafter, the districts, having chosen their deputies, were expected to disband. In fact, the 60 districts refused to desist from meeting regularly, despite their lack of legal status, and a year later became an integral part of the city's government. With the radicalization of the French Revolution, the fearful city and national authorities tried to weaken the power of the districts by reducing their number of 48. Hence, the mutation of the old districts into sections. Finally, the sections opened their doors to everyone, some including women, without any property or status qualifications. This most radical of civic structures, which produced the most democratic assemblies theretofore seen in history, thus slowly elbowed its way into authority, initially without any legal authority whatever, and in flat defiance of the nation-state. For all its limitations, the Parisian sections remain an abiding example of how a seemingly non-legal assembly system can be transformed into a network of revolutionary popular institutions, around which a new society can be structured. What is of immense practical importance is that pre-statist institutions, traditions and sentiments remain alive in varying degrees throughout most of the world. Resistance to the encroachment of oppressive states has been nourished by village, neighborhood and town community networks. Witness such struggles in South Africa, the Middle East and Latin America. The tremors that are now shaking Soviet Russia are due not solely to demands for greater freedom, but to movements for regional and local autonomy that challenge its very existence as a centralized nation-state. To ignore the communal basis of this movement would be as myopic as to ignore the latent instability of every nation-state. Worse would be to take the nation-state as it is for granted and deal with it merely on its own terms. Indeed, whether a state remains more of a state or less, no trifling matter to radical theorists as disparate as Bakunin and Marx, depends heavily upon the power of local, confederal, and community movements to countervail it, and hopefully to establish a dual power that will replace it. The major role that the Madrid citizens' movement played nearly 3 decades ago in weakening the Franco regime would require a major study to do it justice. The problem of dealing with the growing power of nation-states and centralized corporations, property ownership, production, and the like, is precisely a question of power. That is to say, who shall have it, or who shall be denied any power at all? Michel Foucault has done our age no service by making power an evil as such. Foucauldian postmodernist views notwithstanding, the broad mass of people in the world today lack what they need most: the power to challenge the nation-state and arrest the centralization of economic resources, lest future generations see all the gains of humanity dissipated and freedom disappear from social discourse. Minimally, if power is to be socially redistributed so that the ordinary people who do the real work of the world can effectively speak back to those who run social and economic affairs, a movement is vitally needed to educate, mobilize, and using the wisdom of ordinary and extraordinary people alike, initiate local steps to regain power in its most popular and democratic forms. Power of this kind must be collected if we are to take democracy seriously in the newly developed institutions such as assemblies that allow for the direct participation of citizens in public affairs. Without a movement to work towards such a democratic end, including educators who are prepared in turn to be educated, and intellectually sophisticated people who can develop and popularize this project, efforts to challenge power as it is now constituted will simply sputter out in escapades, riots, adventures, and protests. Power that is not retained by the people is power that is given over to the state. Conversely, whatever power the people gain is power that must be taken away from the state. There can be no institutional vacuum where power exists. It is either invested in the people or it is invested in the state. Where the two share power, this condition is extremely precarious and often temporary. Sooner or later, the control of society and its destiny will either shift towards the people and their communities at its base, or toward the professional practitioners of statecraft at its summit. Only if the whole existing pyramidal social structure is dismembered and radically democratized will the issue of domination as such disappear and be completely replaced by participation and the principle of complementarity. Power, however, must be conceived as real, indeed solid and tangible, not only as spiritual and psychological. To ignore the fact that power is a muscular fact of life is to drift from the visionary into the ethereal and mislead the public as to its crucial significance in affecting society's destiny. What this means is that if power is to be regained by the people from the state, the management of society must be deprofessionalized as much as possible. That is to say, it must be simplified and rendered transparent, indeed clear, accessible, and manageable, such that most of its affairs can be run by ordinary citizens. This emphasis on amateurism, as distinguished from professionalism, is not new. It formed the basis of Athenian democratic practice for generations. Indeed, it was so ably practiced that sortition, rather than election, formed the basis of the polis's democracy. It resurfaced repeatedly, for example, in early medieval city charters and confederations, and in the great democratic revolutions of the 18th century. Power is also a solid and tangible fact to be reckoned with militarily, notably in the ubiquitous truth that the power of the state or the people eventually reposes in force. Whether the state has power ultimately depends upon whether it exercises a monopoly of violence. By the same token, whether the people have power ultimately depends upon whether they are armed and create their own grassroots militia, to guard not only themselves from criminals or invaders, but their own power and freedom from ever-encroaching power of the state itself. Here, too, the Athenian, British, and American yeomen knew only too well what a professional military was a threat to liberty, and the state was a vehicle for disarming the people. A true civic-ism that tried to create a genuine politics, an empowered citizenry, and a municipalized economy would be a vulnerable project indeed if it failed to replace the police and the professional army with a popular militia. More specifically, a civic guard, composed of rotating patrols for police purposes and well-trained citizen military contingents for dealing with external dangers to freedom. Greek democracy would never have survived the repeated assaults of the Greek aristocracy without its militia of citizen hoplites, those foot soldiers who could answer the call to arms with their own weapons and elected commanders. The tragic history of the state's ascendancy over free municipalities, even the rise of oligarchy within free cities of the past, is the story of armed professionals who commandeered power from unarmed peoples or disarmed them presumably, as so many liberals would have it today, from the hazards of domestic and neighborhood shootouts. Typically, this is the cowboy or gunslinger image of the American dream, often cynically imposed on its more traditional yeoman face. Beyond the municipal agenda that I have presented thus far lies another, more long-range one. The vision of a political world in which the state as such would finally be replaced completely by a confederal network of municipal assemblies. All socially important forms of property would be absorbed into a truly political economy in which municipalities, interacting with each other economically as well as politically, would resolve their material problems as citizens in open assemblies, not simply as professionals, farmers, and blue or white collar workers, and humanly scaled and physically decentralized municipalities. Not only would people then be able to transform themselves from occupational beings into communally oriented citizens, they would create a world in which all weapons could indeed be beaten into plowshares. Ultimately, it would be possible for new networks of communities to emerge that would be exquisitely tailored, psychologically and spiritually, as well as technologically, architecturally, and structurally, to the natural environments in which they exist. This agenda for a more distant future embodies the ultimate future I have elaborated in greater detail in my previous writings. Its achievement can no longer be seen as a sudden revolution that within a brief span of time will replace the present society with a radical new one. Actually, such revolutions never really happen in history. Even the French Revolution, which radicals have long regarded as a paradigm of sudden social change, was generations in making and did not come to its definitive end until a century later, when the last of the sans-culottes were virtually exterminated on the barricades of the Paris Commune of 1871. Nor can we afford the myth today that barricades are more than a symbol. What links my minimal agenda to my ultimate one is a process, an admittedly long development in which the existing institutions and traditions of freedom are slowly enlarged and expanded. For the present, we must try increasingly to democratize the Republic, a call that consists of preserving and expanding freedoms we have earned centuries ago, together with the institutions that give them reality. For the future, it means that we must radicalize the democracy we create, imparting an even more creative content to the democratic institutions we have rescued and tried to develop. Admittedly, at that later point, we will have moved from a countervailing position that tries to play our democratic institutions against the state into a militant attempt to replace the state with municipally based confederal structures. It is to be devoutly hoped that by that time too, the state power itself will have been hollowed out institutionally by local or civic structures. Indeed, that its very legitimacy, not to speak of its authority as a coercive force, will simply lead to its collapse in any period of confrontation. If the great revolutions of the past provide us with examples of how so major a shift is possible, it would be well to remember that seemingly all-powerful monarchies that the republics replaced 2 centuries ago were so denuded of power that they crumbled rather than fell. Such a mummified corpse turns to dust after it has been suddenly exposed to air. Another future prospect that faces us, a chilling one, in which urbanization so completely devours the city and the countryside that community becomes an archaism, in which a market society filters into the most private recesses of our lives as individuals and effaces all sense of personality, let alone individuality, in which the state renders politics and citizenship not only a mockery, but a maw that absorbs the very notion of freedom itself. This prospect is still sufficiently removed from our most immediate experience that its realization can be arrested by those countervailing forces, that dual power that I have outlined. Given the persistent destructuring of the natural world as well as the social, more than human freedom is in the balance. The rise of reactionary nationalisms and proliferation of nuclear weapons are only two reminders that we may be reaching a point of cosmic finality in our affairs on the planet. Thus, the recovery of a classical concept of politics and citizenship is not only a precondition for a free society, it is also a precondition for our survival as a species. Looming before us is the image of a completely destructured and simplified natural world, as well as a completely destructured and simplified urban world, a natural and social world so divested of its variety that we, like all other complex life forms, will be unable to exist as viable beings. Chapter 9. Dialectical Naturalism. Introduction. For much of the 20th century, relativism has plagued philosophical thought, casting into ever greater philosophical doubt all claims to objective knowledge of reality. In the 1980s and 1990s, the rise of postmodernism and deconstruction have given academic philosophy a further relativistic charge. Claims to objective knowledge have now become deeply problematic, and the tendency is growing when competing claims to knowledge are debated to end merely with an agnostic shrug. Despite such intellectual fashions, however, it is a staple of political action in any era that it must have a philosophical grounding in objective reality. Political action presupposes that a group of people have a coherent understanding of their social condition, a belief that it is necessary and possible to change those surroundings, and a willingness to make a long-term commitment to change them. A merely existential or personal justification, which is all that relativistic philosophy provides, is inadequate, since it leaves the political actors' choices arbitrary and susceptible to change from day to day. It provides no ethics as a foundation for political action, since it finds the very concept of objective ethics even more abhorrent than the concept of objective knowledge. Like any political and social approach, Bookchin's social ecology requires a philosophical grounding. Having absorbed, via the Marxist tradition, the humanism and rationalism of the Enlightenment, Bookchin retains an active commitment to these foundation stones of Western thought to construct not only his political approach, but his nature philosophy. His dialectical naturalism, as he calls it, draws specifically on the dialectical tradition in Western philosophy, whose most important sources are Aristotle's Metaphysics, Hegel's Science of Logic, and Marx's Capital. As an adherent to the humanistic and rationalistic tradition, Bookchin holds that it is indeed possible to gain objective knowledge of first nature. As a participant in the dialectical tradition, he maintains that first nature is a reality in the process of becoming. Substance not only exists, contrary to today's agnostics, it is developing, indeed evolving. That first nature is evolutionary makes it especially suitable for comprehension by dialectical philosophy, which emphasizes processes of directional change that is, becoming, as opposed to being. Aristotle, Hegel, and Marx saw reality as a developmental rather than a static process, with tendencies in the direction of ever greater differentiation, complexity, subjectivity, and wholeness. Bookchin, in keeping with his own ecological approach, melded evolutionary theory into their account, giving dialectical philosophy a naturalistic dimension and rejecting earlier recourses to objective idealism, Hegel, and a crude materialism, Engels, in that tradition. And in keeping with his social anarchistic approach, he explored the libertarian dimensions of the tradition, rejecting the teleology of earlier dialectical thinkers, while retaining a concept of tendency or directionality. Like Hegel, Bookchin considers dialectics not only to give an account of the objective world, but to be a mode of understanding that world. Thus, dialectical naturalism is not only an account of causation, it is also a form of reasoning. Much ecological thinking today, Bookchin maintains, partakes of the relativism so characteristic of the 20th century. It sees the Western mechanistic worldview as a major cause of the ecological crisis, and it considers reason to be endemic to mechanism. Indeed, such thinkers argue the Enlightenment humanistic tradition has generally given priority to human interests over those of first nature. Its emphasis on reason is merely part and parcel of this ecocidal anthropocentrism. They thus reject reason in favour of intuitionism and mysticism as a mode of apprehending or obfuscating reality. Bookchin, by contrast, sees the Enlightenment itself as ecological in a sense that it refocused human attention away from God and the supernatural, precisely onto first nature and naturalistic concerns. To be sure, he admits a type of reason, the instrumental and analytical kind, has been a factor in ecological destruction as well as promoting human misery, when it has been applied inappropriately. This conventional reason, his shorthand name for it, focuses on mechanical causality, the separation of fact and value, and crude empiricism. It is best suited for apprehending non-processual phenomena, but it has been applied outside its province to organic life forms and especially to human society, where it engenders a one-sided and static view of developmental phenomena. Bookchin proposes that dialectical reasoning is a more appropriate mode of engagement with the organic and social worlds, since it emphasizes becoming rather than stasis and regards causes which may be elicited or educed as emergent. Dialectical philosophy not only furnishes a form of ecological thinking, it allows us to educe an objective ethic that can guide us in the presence of ecological crisis, one that will provide an objective ground for advancing an ethical socialism against the market economy and for creating a free society. In his discussions of ecological ethics, Bookchin has been criticized by relatives among others for succumbing to the naturalistic fallacy, that is, for making specious analogies between first nature and second nature. He justifies the appropriateness of diversity, cooperation, and mutuality for human society, they argue, by adducing those very features in first nature. By such reasoning, they argue, we could just as easily claim that first nature is red in tooth and claw, and use that fact to justify social Darwinism in society. But Bookchin is not suggesting that society should mimic first nature, however benign certain aspects of it may be. Rather, he is arguing that certain tendencies, an increase in subjectivity and range of choice, for example, are objectively part of evolution and as such should be promoted wherever possible by human beings. He contends that the values that can be educed from what should be follow rationally from those objective potentialities in natural and social development, which exist as latent realities, not as speculations or abstract values. This tendency toward greater consciousness and choice constitutes the potential by which the natural and social worlds may become self-conscious and self-directive in human reason and rational action. The self-formative biosphere, including both first and second nature, could potentially find its realization in a free nature. Since this ecological and rational society has not yet been attained, its potentiality exists as an ethical should-be, against which we may judge the failings of present society. Its attainment will be the fulfillment of human emancipation. Objectively grounded ethics. If we desperately need an ethics that will join the ideal with the real and give words like realism a richer, more rational meaning than they have, then we are faced with a traditional dilemma. How can we objectively validate ethical claims in an era of moral relativism, when good and bad, right and wrong, virtue and evil, even the selection of strategies for social change, are completely subjectivized into matters of taste or opinion? The overstated claim that what is good for a highly personalized me may not be good for an equally personalized you speaks to the growing amorality of our time. Accordingly, such a moral relativism has acquired the sanctity of a constitutional precept in our system of government. It has become the standard by which to determine the criminality of behavior and the guiding principles of diplomacy, religion, politics, and education, not to mention business and personal affairs. The subjectivization of behavioral precepts reflects the universal opportunism of the time. Its emphasis is on the operational ways of life as distinguished from philosophical ones, especially on ways to survive and function rather than on ideas imbued with meaning. The moral relativism that deliver us to a totally non-critical view of a world in which mere taste and fleeting opinion justify anything, including nuclear immolation, has been stressed enough not to require further elucidation. If mere opinion suffices to validate social behavior, then the social order itself can be validated simply by public opinion polls. Hence, whether capital punishment is right or wrong ceases to be an ethical question about the sanctity of life. The issue becomes a problem of juggling percentages, which may justify the slaughter of homicidal felons during 1 year and the right to live under another. Whether the figures of our polls go up or down can decide whether a given number of people will be put to death or not. Carried to its logical conclusion, this personalistic, operational view of morality can justify a totalitarian society which abolishes the very claims of the individual. It was not from a sense of irony or perversity that visitors to Mussolini's Italy in the 1920s applauded a fascist regime because Italian trains operated on time. The efficiency of a social system and mere matters of personal convenience were identified with its claims to be the embodiment of the public welfare. To exercise moral relativism, with its distasteful extensions into a politics of lesser evils, and a practice structured around risk versus benefit calculations, is a vexing problem indeed. The converse of a radical moral relativism is a radical moral absolutism, which can be as totalitarian in its power to control as its relativistic opposite is democratic in its power to relax. Both live in a curious intellectual symbiosis. The seeming pluralism of a moral democracy has been known to encompass a fascistic ethics as easily as an anarchic one, which raises the question of how to keep a democracy from voting itself out of existence. Suffice it to say that moral absolutism is neither better nor worse than the concrete message it has to offer. An ethics grounded in ecology can yield a salad of natural laws that are as tyrannical as their conclusions as the chaos of moral relativism is precariously wayward. To appeal from ecology to God is to leap from nature to supernature. That is, ironically, from the human subject as it exists in the real world to the way it exists in the imagination. Religious precepts are the products of priests and visionaries, not of an objective world from which we can gain an ethical direction that is the commanding dictum neither of natural law on one hand, nor of supernatural law on the other. We have learned only too well that Hitler's blood and soil naturism, like Stalin's cosmological so-called dialectics, can be used as viciously as notions of natural law, with all their Darwinian connotations of fitness to survive and natural selection, to collect millions of people in concentration camps, where they are worked to death, incinerated, or both. Indeed, the suspicion surrounding the choice of nature as a ground for ethics is justified by a history of nature philosophies that gave validity to oligarchy, Plato, slavery, Aristotle, hierarchy, Aquinas, necessity, Spinoza, and domination, Marx, to single out the better-known thinkers of Western philosophy. Rarely indeed has nature itself been seen as a nascent domain of freedom, selfhood, and consciousness. Almost invariably, Western thinkers have dealt with the natural world as a wilderness that has always been hostile to humanity or controlled by natural law, a lawfulness unerring in its necessitarian relationships. It is here that social ecology fills a void in an objective ethics that is neither absolutist nor relativist, authoritarian nor chaotic, necessitarian nor arbitrary, with all the pitfalls for humanity that these paired notions have yielded. Given social ecology's emphasis on nature's fecundity, on its thrust toward increasing variety, on its limitless capacity to differentiate life forms, and its development of richer, more varied evolutionary pathways that steadily involve ever more complex species, our vision of the natural world begins to change. We no longer need to look upon it as necessitarian, withholding, or stingy redoubt of blind cruelty and harsh determinism. Although never a realm of freedom, nature is not reducible to an equally fictitious realm of necessity as earlier philosophers, social thinkers, and scientists claimed. The possibility of freedom and individuation is opened up by the rudimentary forms of self-selection, perhaps even choice, if you will, of the most nascent and barely formed kind that emerges from the increasing complexity of species and their alternate pathways of evolution. Here, without doing violence to the facts, we can begin to point to a thrust in evolution that contains the potentialities of freedom and individuation. Here, too, we can see certain premises for social life, conceived, to be sure, as the institutionalization of the animal community into a potentially rational, self-governing form of association, and, owing to the ever greater complexity of the nervous system and brain, for the emergence of reason itself. This ensemble of ideas, I submit, provides us with the basis for an ecological ethics that sees selfhood, reason, and freedom as emerging from nature, not in sharp opposition to nature. Natural evolution, over time, gives rise from within itself to a rich wealth of gradations that open the way to social evolution. In short, two evolutionary pathways in which one is parent to the other. The traditional dualism in human thought that pitted humanity against animality, society against nature, freedom against necessity, mind against body, and in its most insidious hierarchical form, man against woman, is transcended by due recognition of the continuity between the two, but without a reductionism or oneness that yields, in Hegel's words, a night in which all cows are black. This transcendence is achieved historically, not by arguing out the problem from within the trenches of biology and society, as though each could be discussed and explored separately from the other, and then constructing some kind of mechanical apparatus to bridge the gap between these dualities, with the use of an evolutionary approach to explain the evolution of humanity out of animality, society out of nature, and mind out of body. We shed socio-biology's tyrannical morality of the gene. We also free ourselves from anti-humanism's reductionist dissolution of human uniqueness into a cosmic community in which ants are equatable with people. From the infamous lifeboat ethic that denies the need to share the means of life with others who are less privileged. From an overtly National Socialist outlook that validates the authority of self-appointed supermen to dominate subhumans. And from a Stalinist reduction of human beings to the raw material of a history governed by the inexorable laws of dialectical materialism. Let me emphasize that social ecology, while viewing nature as a ground for an ethics of freedom and individuation, does not see an inexorable lawfulness at work that derives the human from the non-human or society from nature. Social ecology is not only a philosophy of process, it is also a philosophy of potentiality. Potentiality involves a sensitivity to the latent possibilities that inhere in a given constellation of phenomena, not a surrender to predetermined inevitability. It is the capability to be that is not as yet in being, a process in which the conditions for a specific line of development exist, but have yet to achieve fruition as a whole, with all its wealth of fullness, self-development and uniqueness. Analogies more often tell us what this approach to reality is than propositional elucidations. The acorn, for example, which has the potentiality to become an oak tree, or the human embryo, which has the potentiality to become a fully mature and creative adult. This notion, in any case, is a message of freedom, not of necessity. It speaks to an imminent striving for realization, not to a predetermined certainty of completion. What is potential in an acorn that yields an oak tree, or a human embryo that yields a mature, creative adult, is equivalent to what is potential in nature that yields society, and what is potential in society that yields freedom, selfhood, and consciousness. A philosophical naturalism. Today, even sensitive people in growing numbers feel betrayed by the centuries-long glorification of reason, with its icy claims to efficiency, objectivity, and freedom from ethical constraint. The form of reason that has nourished particularly destructive technologies like nucleonics and weaponry. This negative popular reaction is understandable, but swerving away from a specific form of reason that is largely instrumental and coldly analytical creates problems that are no less disturbing than those questions from which we are seeking to escape. In our aversion to an insensitive and unfeeling form of reason, we may easily opt for a cloudy intuitionism and mysticism as an alternative. Unlike instrumental and analytical reason, after all, a surrender to emotion and mythic beliefs yields cooperative feelings of interconnectedness with the natural world, and perhaps even a caring attitude toward it. But precisely because intuition and mystical beliefs are so cloudy and arbitrary, which is to say, so unreasoned, they may also connect us with things we really shouldn't be connected with at all, namely racism, sexism, and an abject subservience to charismatic leaders. Indeed, following this intuitional alternative could potentially render our ecological outlook very dangerous. Vital as the idea of interconnectedness may be to our views, it has historically often been the basis of myths and supernatural beliefs that became means for social control and political manipulation. The first half of the 20th century is in great part the story of brutal movements like National Socialism that fed on a popular anti-rationalism and anti-intellectualism, and a personal sense of alienation, among other things. This movement mobilized and homogenized millions of people with an antisocial, perverted, ecologistic ideology based on intuition, with an interconnectedness of earth, folk, and blood and soil that was militaristic and murderous rather than freely communitarian. Insulated from the challenge of rational critique by its anti-intellectualism and mythic nationalism, the National Socialist movement eventually turned much of Europe into a cemetery, yet ideologically this fascist totalitarianism had gained sustenance from the intuitional and mystical credo of the Romantic movement of the century before, something no one could have foreseen at the time. Feeling, sentiment, and a moral outlook we surely need if instrumental and analytical reason are not to divest us of our passion for truth. But myths, mind-numbing rituals, and charismatic personalities can also rob us of the critical faculties that thought provides. Recently, a green organization in Canada flippantly proclaimed that it seeks cooperation as part of its new paradigm, rather than confrontation, which it considers part of the rejected old paradigm. In a more radical era, confrontation was the stated purpose of radical movements. The mythic and uncritical aspect of interconnectedness that rejects confrontation seems to have reduced this organization to the level of outright accommodation with the status quo. Here, the need not only to confront the evils of our time, but to uncompromisingly oppose them has disappeared into a new age quagmire of unthinking good vibes. The loving path of compromises along which such good vibes lead us can easily end in sheer opportunism. If our contemporary revolt against reason rests on the misguided belief that the only alternative to our present reality is mysticism, it also rests on the equally misguided belief that only one kind of reason exists. In reacting against instrumental and analytical forms of reason, which are usually identified with reason as such, we may well overlook other forms of reason that are organic and yet retain critical qualities, that are developmental and yet retain analytical insights, that are ethical and yet retain contact with reality. The value-free rationalism that we normally identify with the physical sciences and technology is, in fact, not the only form of reason that Western philosophy has developed over the centuries. I refer specifically to the great tradition of dialectical reason that originated in Greece some 25 years ago and reached its high point, but by no means its completion, in the logical works of Hegel. What dialectical thinkers from Heraclitus onward had in common, in varying degrees, is a view of reality as developmental, of being as an ever-unfolding becoming. Ever since Plato created a dualism between a supernatural world of ideal forms and a transient world of imperfect sensible copies, the perplexing question of identity amid change and change amid identity has haunted Western philosophy. Instrumental and analytical forms of reason, what I will here generically call conventional reason, rests on a fundamental principle, the famous principle of identity, or A equals A, which means that any given phenomenon can be only itself and cannot be other than what it is, or what we immediately perceive it to be at a given moment in time. Without this principle, logical consistency in conventional reason would be impossible. Conventional reason is based on an analysis of phenomena as precisely defined, and whose truth depends upon the internal consistency and their practicality. It focuses on a thing or phenomenon as fixed, with clear-cut boundaries, and are immutable for analytical purposes. We know an entity in this widely accepted notion of reason when we analyze it to its irreducible components and determine how they work as a functioning whole, so that knowledge of the entity will have operational applicability. When the boundaries that define a developing thing change, as, for instance, when sand becomes soil, then conventional reason treats sand as sand and soil as soil, much as if they were independent of each other. The zone of interest in this kind of rationality is a thing or phenomenon's fixity, its independence, and its basically mechanical interaction with similar or dissimilar things and phenomena. The causality that conventional reason describes, moreover, is a matter of kinetics. One billiard ball strikes another and causes them both to move from one position to another, that is to say, by means of efficient cause. The two billiard balls are not altered by the blow, but are merely repositioned on the billiards table. But conventional reason cannot address the problem of change at all. It views a mammal, for example, as a creature marked by a highly fixed set of traits that distinguish it from everything that is not mammalian. To know a mammal is to explore its structure, literally to analyze it by dismembering it, to reduce it to its components, to identify its organs and its functions, and to ascertain the way they operate together to assure the mammal's survival and reproduction. Similarly, conventional reason views a human being in terms of particular stages of the life cycle. A person is an infant at one time, a child at another, an adolescent at still another, a youth, and finally an adult. When we analyze an infant by means of conventional reason, we do not explore what it is becoming in the process of developing into an adult. Doubtless, when developmental psychologists and anatomists study an individual life cycle, few of them, however conventional their rationality may be, ignore the fact that every infant is in the process of becoming an adult, and that the two stages in the life cycle are in various ways related to each other. But the principle of A equals A remains a basic premise. Its logical framework is the authority of consistency, and deductions almost mechanically follow from premises. Conventional reason thus serves the practical function of describing a given entity's identity and telling us how the entity is organized to be itself. But it cannot systematically explore processes of becoming, or how a living entity is patterned as a potentiality to phase from one stage of its development into another. Dialectical reason unlike conventional reason, acknowledges the developmental nature of reality by asserting in one fashion or another, A equals not only A, but also not A. The dialectical thinker who examines the human life cycle sees an infant as a self-maintaining human identity while simultaneously developing into a child, from a child into an adolescent, from an adolescent into a youth, and a youth into an adult. Dialectical reason grasps not only how an entity is organized at a particular moment, but how it is organized to go beyond the level of development and become other than what it is, even as it retains its identity. The contradictory nature of identity, notably that A equals both A and not A, is an intrinsic feature of identity itself. The unity of opposites is, in fact, a unity qua the emerging other, what Hegel calls the identity of identity and non-identity. The thinking of conventional reason today is exemplified and disastrously reinforced by the true or false question that make up most standardized tests. One must darken a box to indicate that a statement is either true or false, and do so quickly with minimal reflection. These tests, so commonplace today, allow for no nuanced thought or awareness of transitions. That a phenomenon or statement may well be both true and false, depending on its context and its place in the process of becoming other than what it is excluded by the logical premise on which these tests are based. This testing procedure makes for bad mental habits among young people, who are schooled to take such tests successfully, and whose careers and future lifeways depend on their scores. But the process of thinking in the way such tests demand compartmentalizes and essentially computerizes otherwise rich minds, depriving young people of their native ability to think organically and to understand the developmental nature of the real world. Another major presupposition of conventional reason, one that follows from its concepts of identity and causality, is that history is a layered series of separate phenomena, a mere succession of strata, each independent of the ones that preceded and followed it. These strata may be cemented together by phases, but these phases are themselves analyzed into components and explored independently of each other. Thus, Mesozoic rock strata are independent of Cenozoic, and each stratum exists very much on its own, as do the ones that cement them together. In human history, the medieval period is independent of the modern, and the former is connected to the latter by a series of independent segments, each relatively autonomous in relation to the preceding and subsequent ones. From the standpoint of conventional reason, it is not always clear how historical change occurred, or what meaning history has. Despite postmodernism and present-day historical relativism, which examine history using conventional reason and thereby ravage it, there was a time in the recent past when most historians, influenced by theories of evolution and by Marxism, regarded history as a developmental phenomenon and subsequent periods at least depending upon prior ones. It is this tradition that dialectical reason upholds. The intuitional approach to history is no improvement over that of conventional reason. Indeed, it does the opposite. It literally dissolves historical development into an undifferentiated continuum, and even into a ubiquitous, all-embracing one. The mystical counterpart of mechanico-materialistic stratification is the reductionism that says everything is one or interconnected, that all phenomena originated from a pulse of primal energy, like the Victorian physicist who believed that, when he pounded his fist on the table, Sirius trembled, however faintly. That the universe had an origin, whatever it was, does not warrant the naive belief that the universe still really consists of nothing but its originating source, any more than an adult human being can be explained entirely by reference to his or her parents. This way of thinking is not so far removed from the kinetic cause-effect approach of conventional reason. Nor does the interconnectedness of all life forms preclude the sharp distinctions between prey and predators, or between instinctively guided life forms and potentially rational ones. Yet these countless differentiations reflect innumerable innovations in evolutionary pathways. Indeed, different kinds of evolution, be they inorganic, organic, or social. Instead of apprehending things and phenomena as both differentiated and yet cumulatively related, the mystical alternative to conventional reason tends to see them, to use Hegel's famous remark, as a night in which all cows are black. Conventional reason, to be sure, has its useful side. Its internal consistency of propositions, irrespective of content, plays an indispensable role in mathematical thinking and mathematical sciences, in engineering, and in the nuts and bolts activities of everyday life. It is indispensable when building a bridge or a house. For such purposes, there is no point in thinking along evolutionary or developmental lines. If we used a logic based on anything but the principle of identity to build a bridge or a house, a catastrophe would no doubt occur. The physiological operations of our bodies, not to speak of the flight of birds and the pump-like workings of a mammalian heart, depend in great part upon principles we associate with conventional reason. To understand or design a mechanical entity requires a form of reason that is instrumental and an analysis of reality into its components and their functioning. The truths of conventional reason, based on consistency, are useful in these areas of life. Indeed, conventional reason has contributed immeasurably to our knowledge of the universe. For several centuries, in fact, conventional reason held out a promise to dispel the dogmatic authority of the Church, the arbitrary behaviour of absolute monarchs, and the frightening ghosts of superstition, and indeed it did a great deal to fulfil this promise. But to achieve the consistency that constitutes its fundamental principle, conventional reason removes ethics from its discourse and concerns, and as an instrument for achieving certain ends, the moral character of those ends, the values, ideals, beliefs, and theories people cherish, are irrelevant to it, arbitrary matters of personal mood and taste. With its message of identity and consistency as truth, conventional reason failed us not because it is false as such, but because it has staked out too broad a claim for its own validity in explaining reality. It even redefines reality to fit its claim, just as many mathematical physicists redefine reality as that which can be formulated in mathematical terms. It should come as no surprise then, that in our highly rationalized industrial society, conventional reason has come to seem repellent. Pervasive authority and impersonal technocracy, and unfeeling science and insensitivity, monolithic bureaucracies, the very existence of all these is imputed to reason as such. Let us grant that the principles of identity, of efficient causality, and of stratification do apply to a particular commonsensical reality that is rendered intelligible by their use. But when we go beyond that particular reality, we can no longer reduce the rich wealth of differentiation, flux, development, organic causality, and developmental reality to a vague one, or to an equally vague notion of interconnectedness. A very considerable literature dating back to the ancient Greeks provides the basis of an organic form of reason and a developmental interpretation of reality. With a few notable exceptions, the Platonic dualism of identity and change reverberated in one way or another throughout Western philosophy until the 19th century, when Hegel's logical works largely resolved this paradox by systematically showing that identity, or self-persistence, actually expresses itself through change as an ever-variegated unfolding of unity in diversity, to use his own words. The grandeur of Hegel's effort has no equal in the history of Western philosophy. Like Aristotle before him, he had an emergent interpretation of causality, of how the implicit becomes explicit through the unfolding of its latent form and possibilities. On a vast scale, over the course of 2 sizable volumes, he assembled nearly all the categories of which reason explains reality, and educed one from the other in an intelligible and meaningful continuum that is graded into a richly differentiated, increasingly comprehensive, or adequate whole, to use some of his terms. We may reject that Hegel called his absolute idealism the transition from his logic to his philosophy of nature, his teleological culmination of the subjective and objective in the godlike absolute, and his idea of a cosmic spirit, Geist. Hegel rarefied dialectical reason into a cosmological system that verged on the theological by trying to reconcile it with idealism, absolute knowledge, and a mystical unfolding, logos, that he often designated God. Unfamiliar with ecology, Hegel rejected natural evolution as a viable theory in favor of a static hierarchy of being. By the same token, Friedrich Engels intermingled dialectical reason with natural laws that more closely resemble the premises of 19th century physics than a plastic metaphysics or an organismic outlook, producing a crude dialectical materialism. Indeed, so enamored was Engels of matter and motion as the irreducible attributes of being, that a kineticism based on mere motion invaded his dialectic of organic development. To dismiss dialectical reason because of the failings of Hegel's idealism and Engels's materialism, however, would be to lose sight of the extraordinary coherence that dialectical reason can furnish and its extraordinary applicability to ecology, particularly to an ecology rooted in evolutionary development. Despite Hegel's own prejudices against organic evolution, what stands out amid the metaphysical and often theological archaisms in his work is his overall eduction of logical categories as the subjective anatomy of a developmental reality. What is needed is to free this form of reason from both the quasi-mystical and narrowly scientistic worldviews that in the past have made it remote from the living world, to separate it from Hegel's Empyrean, basically anti-naturalistic dialectical idealism and the wooden, often scientistic dialectical materialism of orthodox Marxists. Shorn of both its idealism and its materialism, dialectical reason may be rendered naturalistic and ecological, and conceived as a naturalistic form of thinking. This dialectical naturalism offers an alternative to an ecology movement that rightly distrusts conventional reason. It can bring coherence to ecological thinking, and it can dispel arbitrary and anti-intellectual tendencies toward the sentimental, cloudy and theistic at best, and the dangerously anti-rational and potentially reactionary at worst. As a way of reasoning about reality, dialectical naturalism is organic enough to give a more liberatory meaning to vague words like interconnectedness and holism without sacrificing intellectuality. It can answer the questions I posed at the beginning of this essay: what nature is, humanity's place in nature, the thrust of natural evolution, and society's relationship with the natural world. Equally important, dialectical naturalism adds an evolutionary perspective to ecological thinking, despite Hegel's rejection of natural evolution and Engels' recourse to the mechanistic evolutionary theories of a century ago. Dialectical naturalism discerns evolutionary phenomena fluidly and plastically, yet it does not divest evolution of rational interpretation. Finally, a dialectic that has been ecologized or given a naturalistic core, and a truly developmental understanding of reality could provide the basis for a living ecological ethics. Minimally, we must assume that there is order in the world, an assumption that even ordinary science must make if it is to exist. Minimally too, we must assume that there are growth and processes that lead to differentiation, not merely the kind of motion that results from push-pull, gravitational, electromagnetic and similar forces. Finally, minimally, we must assume that there is some kind of directionality toward ever greater differentiation or wholeness insofar as potentiality is realized in its full actuality. We need not return to medieval teleological notions of an unswerving predetermination in a hierarchy of being to accept this directionality. Rather, we need only point to the fact that there is a generally orderly development in the real world, or to use philosophical terminology, a logical development when a development succeeds in becoming what it is structured to become. In Hegel's logical works, as in Aristotle's Metaphysics, dialectics is more than a remarkable method for dealing with reality. Conceived as the logical expression of a wide-ranging form of developmental causality, logic, in Hegel's work, joins hands with ontology. Dialectic is simultaneously a way of reasoning and an account of the objective world with an ontological causality. As a form of reasoning, the most basic categories in dialectic, even such vague categories as being and nothing, are differentiated by their own inner logic into fuller, more complex categories. Each category in turn is a potentiality that by means of inductive thinking, directed toward an exploration of its latent and implicit possibilities, yields logical expression in self-realization, or what Hegel calls actuality, Wirklichkeit. Precisely because it is also a system of causality, dialectic is ontological, objective and therefore naturalistic, as well as a form of reason. In ontological terms, dialectical causality is not merely motion, force, or changes of form, but things and phenomena in development. Indeed, since all being is becoming, dialectical causality is the differentiation of potentiality into actuality, in the course of which each new actuality becomes the potentiality for further differentiation and actualization. Dialectics explicates how processes occur not only in the natural world, but in the social. How the implicit but relatively undifferentiated form, latent with possibility, becomes a more differentiated form that is true to its potential form, is clarified in Hegel's own words. Quote, "The plant, for example, does not lose itself in mere indefinite change," he writes. It has a distinct directionality, in the case of conscious beings, purpose as well. Quote, "From the germ, much is produced when at first nothing was to be seen, but the whole of what is brought forth, if not developed, is yet hidden and ideally contained within itself." Unquote. It is worth noting in this passage that what may be brought forth is not necessarily developed. An acorn, for example, may become food for a squirrel or wither on a concrete sidewalk, rather than develop into what it is potentially constituted to become, notably an oak tree. Quote, "The principle of this projection into existence is that the germ cannot remain merely implicit." Unquote. Hegel goes on to observe, quote, "but is impelled towards development since it presents the contradiction of being only implicit." Unquote. What we vaguely call the immanent factors that produce the self-unfolding of a development, the Hegelian dialectic regards as the contradictory nature of being that is unfulfilled in the sense that it is only implicit or incomplete. As mere potentiality, it has not come to itself, so to speak. The thing or phenomenon in dialectical causality remains unsettled, unstable in tension, much as a fetus ripening toward birth strains to be born because of the way it is constituted, until it develops itself into what it should be in all its wholeness or fullness. It cannot remain in endless tension or contradiction with what it is organized to become, without warping or undoing itself. It must ripen into the fullness of its being. Modern science has tried to describe nearly all phenomena in terms of efficient cause, or the kinetic impact of forces on a thing or phenomenon, reacting against medieval conceptions of causality in terms of final cause, notably in terms of the existence of a deity who impels development, or only by virtue of his own perfection. Hegel's notion of imperfection, more appropriately, of inadequacy or of contradiction, as an impelling factor for development, partly went beyond both efficient and final notions of causality. I say partly for a specific reason. The philosophical archaisms that run through Hegel's dialectic weaken his position from a naturalistic viewpoint. From Plato's time until the beginning of the modern world, theological notions of perfection, infinity, and eternality permeated philosophical thought. Plato's ideal forms were the perfect and the eternal, of which all existential things were copies. Aristotle's God, particularly as it was Christianized by the medieval scholastics, was the perfect one toward which all things strove. Given their finite imperfection and inherent limitations, was the perfect one toward which all things strove, given their finite imperfection and inherent limitations. In this way, a supranatural ideal defined the imperfection of natural phenomena and thereby dynamized them in their striving toward perfection. There is an element of this quasi-theological thinking in Hegel's notion of contradiction. The whole course of the dialectic culminates in the absolute, which is perfect in its fullness, wholeness, and unity. Dialectical naturalism, on the contrary, conceives finiteness and contradiction as distinctly natural in a sense that things and phenomena are incomplete and unactualized in their development, not imperfect in any idealistic or supranatural sense, until they are what they have been constituted to become. They exist in a dynamic tension. A dialectical naturalist view thus has nothing to do with the supposition that finite things or phenomena fail to approximate a Platonic ideal or a scholastic God. Rather, they are still in the process of becoming, or more mundanely, developing. Dialectical naturalism thus does not terminate in a Hegelian absolute at the end of a cosmic developmental path, but rather advances the vision of an ever-increasing wholeness, fullness, and richness of differentiation and subjectivity. Dialectical contradiction exists within the structure of a thing or phenomenon by virtue of a formal arrangement that is incomplete, inadequate, implicit, and unfulfilled in relation to what it should be. A naturalistic framework does not limit us to efficient causality with a mechanistic tilt. Nor need we have recourse to theistic perfection to explain the most magnetic eliciting of a development. Dialectical causality is uniquely organic because it operates within a development, the degree of form of a thing or phenomenon, the way in which that form is organized, the tensions or contradictions to which its formal ensemble gives rise, and its metabolic self-maintenance and self-development. Perhaps the most suitable word for this kind of development is growth. Growth not by mere accretion, but by a truly immanent process of organic self-formation in a graded and increasingly differentiated direction. A distinctive continuum emerges from dialectical causality. Here, cause and effect are not merely coexisting phenomena or correlations, to use a common positivist term. Nor are they clearly distinct from each other, such that a cause externally impacts upon a thing or phenomenon to produce an effect mechanically. Dialectical causality is cumulative. The implicit or in itself, an sich, to use Hegel's terminology, is not simply replaced or negated by its more developed explicit or for itself, für sich. Rather, it is absorbed into and developed beyond the explicit into a fuller, more differentiated and more adequate form, the Hegelian in and for itself, an und für sich. Insofar as the implicit is fully actualized by becoming what it is constituted to be, the process is truly rational, that is to say, it is fulfilled by virtue of its internal logic. The continuum of a development is cumulative, containing the history of its development. Reality is not simply what we experience. There is a sense in which the rational has its own reality. Thus, there are existing realities that are irrational and unrealized realities that are rational. A society that fails to actualize its potentialities for human happiness and progress is real enough in the sense that it exists, but it is less than truly social. It is incomplete and distorted insofar as it persists, and hence it is irrational. It is less than what it should be socially, just as a generally defective animal is less than what it should be biologically. Although it is real in an existential sense, it is unfulfilled and hence unreal in terms of its potentialities. Dialectical naturalism asks which is truly real, the incomplete, aborted, irrational what is, or the complete, fully developed, rational what should be. Reason, cast as dialectical causality, as well as dialectical logic, yields an unconventional understanding of reality, a process that follows its immanent self-development to its logical actuality is more properly real than a given what is, that is aborted or distorted and hence in Hegelian terms, untrue to its possibilities. Reason has the obligation to explore the potentialities that are latent in any social development and educe its authentic actualization, its fulfillment and truth through a new and more rational social dispensation. It would be philosophically frivolous to embrace the what is of a thing or phenomenon as constituting its reality, without considering it in the light of the what should be that would logically emerge from its potentialities. Nor do we ordinarily do so in practice. We rightly evaluate an individual in terms of his or her known potentialities, and we form understandable judgments about whether the individual has truly fulfilled himself or herself. Indeed, in privacy, individuals make such self-evaluations repeatedly, which may have important effects upon their behavior, creativity, and self-esteem. The what is, conceived as the strictly existential, is a slippery reality. Accepted empirically without qualification, it excludes the past because, strictly speaking, the past no longer is. At the same time, it yields a discontinuity with the future that, again, strictly speaking, has yet to exist. What is more, the what is, conceived in strictly empirical terms, excludes subjectivity, certainly conceptual thought, from any role in the world but a spectatorial one, which may or may not be a force in behavior. In the logic of a strictly empirical philosophy, mind simply registers or coordinates experience. Reality is a given temporal moment that exists as an experienced segment of an assumed continuum. The real is a frozen here and now, to which we merely add an adventitious past and presume a future, in order to experience reality intelligibly. The kind of radical empiricism advanced by David Hume replaced the notion of being as becoming with the experience of a given moment that renders thinking of the past as unreal, as making inferences about the future. This kind of reality, as Hume himself fully sensed, is impossible to live with an everyday life. Hence, he was obliged to define continuity, although he did so in terms of custom and habit, not in terms of causality. Conceiving immediate empirical reality as the totality of the real essentially banishes hindsight and foresight as little more than mere conveniences. Indeed, a strictly empirical approach dissolves the logical tissue that integrates the organic, cumulative continuity of the past with the present and that of both with the future. By contrast, in a naturalistic dialectic, both past and future are part of a cumulative, logical, and objective continuum that includes the present. Reason is not only a means for analyzing and interpreting reality, it extends the boundaries of reality beyond the immediately experienced present. Past, present, and future are a cumulatively graded process that thought can truly interpret and render meaningful. We can legitimately explore such a process in terms of whether its potentialities have been realized, aborted, or warped. In a naturalistic dialectic, the word reality thus acquires two distinctly different meanings. There is the immediate present empirical reality, or Realität, to use Hegel's language, that need not be the fulfillment of a potentiality. And there is the dialectical actuality, Wirklichkeit, that constitutes a complete fulfillment of a rational process. Even though Wirklichkeit appears as a projection of thought into a future that has yet to be existentially realized, the potentiality from which that Wirklichkeit develops is as existential as the world we sense in direct and immediate ordinary experience. For example, an egg patently and empirically exists, even though the bird whose potential it contains has yet to develop and reach maturity. Just so the given potentiality of any process exists and constitutes the basis for a process that should be realized. Hence, the potentiality does exist objectively, even in empirical terms. Wirklichkeit is what dialectical naturalism infers from an objectively given potentiality. It is present, if only implicitly, as an existential fact, and dialectical reason can analyze and subject it to processual inferences. Even in the seemingly most subjective projections of speculative reason, Wirklichkeit, the what should be, is anchored in a continuum that emerges from an objective potentiality, or what is. Dialectical naturalism is thus integrally wedded to the objective world, a world in which being is becoming. Let me emphasize that dialectical naturalism not only grasps reality as an existentially unfolding continuum, but it also forms an objective framework for making ethical judgments. The what should be becomes an ethical criterion for judging the truth or validity of an objective what is. Thus, ethics is not merely a matter of personal taste and values. It is factually anchored in the world itself as an objective standard of self-realization. Whether a society is good or bad, moral or immoral, for example, can be objectively determined by whether it has fulfilled its potentialities for rationality and morality. Potentialities that are themselves actualizations of a dialectical continuum present the challenge of ethical self-fulfillment, not simply in the privacy of the mind, but in the reality of the processual world. Herein lies the only meaningful basis for a truly ethical socialism or anarchism, one that is more than a body of subjective preferences that rests on opinions and taste. If dialectical naturalism is to explain things or phenomena properly, its ontology and premises must be understood as more than mere motion and interconnection. A continuum is a more relevant premise for dialectical reason than either motion or the interdependence of phenomena. It was one of the failings of dialectical materialism that it premised dialectic on a 19th century's physics of matter and motion, from which development somehow managed to emerge. It would be just as limited to replace the intellectual processes involved in differentiation and the realization of potentiality with interconnectedness. A dialectic based merely on a notion of interconnectedness would tend to be more descriptive than educative. It would not clearly explain how interdependencies led to a graded intellectual development, that is, to self-formation through the self-realization of potentiality. The continuum that dialectical reason investigates, richly intellectual, logically educative, and self-directive process of unfolding toward ever greater differentiation, wholeness, and adequacy, insofar as each potentiality is fully actualized given a specific range of development. External factors, internal rearrangements, accidents, even gross irrationalities may distort or preclude a potential development. But insofar as order does exist in reality, and is not simply imposed upon it by mind, reality has a rational dimension. More colloquially, there is a logic in the development of a phenomena, a general directiveness that accounts for the fact that the inorganic did become organic, as a result of its implicit capacity for organicity, and for the fact that the organic did become more differentiated and metabolically self-maintaining and self-aware, as a result of potentialities that made for highly developed hormonal and nervous systems. Stephen Jay Gould may luxuriate in the randomness, actually the fecundity of nature, and post-structuralists may try to dissolve both natural and social evolution into an aggregation of unrelated events. But directiveness of organic evolution unremittingly surfaces in even these rather chaotic collections of brute facts. Like it or not, human beings, primates, mammals, vertebrates, and so forth, back to the most elementary protozoans, are a sequential presence in the fossil record itself, each emerging out of the preceding lifeforms. As Gould asserts, the Burgess Shale of British Columbia attests to a large variety of fossils that cannot be classified into a unilinear chain of being. But far from challenging the existence of directionality in evolution toward greater subjectivity, the Burgess Shale provides extraordinary evidence of the fecundity of nature. Nature's fecundity rests on the existence of chance, indeed variety, as a precondition for complexity in organisms and ecosystems, and by virtue of that fecundity, for the emergence of humanity from potentialities that involve increasing subjectivity. Our ontological and inductive premise for dialectical naturalism, however, remains the graded continuum I have already described, and, the Burgess Shale notwithstanding, human beings are not only patently here, but our evolution can be explained. Dialectical reason cuts across the grain of conventional ways of thinking about the natural world and mystical interpretations of it. Nature is not simply the landscape we see from behind a picture window, in a moment disconnected from those that precede and will follow it, nor is it a vista from a lofty mountain peak. Nature is certainly all of these things, but it is significantly more. Biological nature is above all the cumulative evolution of ever differentiating and increasingly complex lifeforms, with a vibrant and interactive inorganic world. Following in a tradition that goes back to at least Cicero, we can call this relatively unconscious natural development first nature. It is first nature in the primal sense of a fossil record that clearly leads to mammalian, primate, and human life, not to mention its extraordinary fecundity for other lifeforms. And it is first nature that exhibits a high degree of orderly continuity in the actualization of potentialities that made for complex and self-aware or subjective lifeforms. Insofar as this continuity is intelligible, it has meaning and rationality in terms of its results, the elaboration of lifeforms that can conceptualize, understand, and communicate with each other in increasingly symbolic terms. In their most differentiated and fully developed forms, these self-reflexive and communicative capacities are conceptual thought and language. The human species has these capacities to an extent that is unprecedented in any existing lifeform. Humanity's awareness of itself, its ability to generalize this awareness to the level of a highly systematic understanding of its environment in the form of philosophy, science, ethics, and aesthetics, and finally, its capacity to alter itself and its environment systematically by means of knowledge and technology, place it, beyond the realm of the subjectivity that exists in first nature. By singling out humanity as a unique life form that can consciously change the entire realm of first nature, I do not claim that first nature was made to be exploited by humanity, as those ecologists critical of so-called anthropocentrism sometimes charge. The idea of a made world has its origin in theology, notably in the belief that a supernatural being created the natural world and that evolution is infused with a theistic principle, both in the service of human needs. By the same token, humans cannot exploit nature owing to a commanding place in the supposed hierarchy of nature. Words like commanding, exploitation, and hierarchy are actually social terms that describe how people relate to each other. Applied to the natural world, they are merely anthropomorphic. Far more relevant from the standpoint of dialectical naturalism is the fact that humanity's vast capacity to alter first nature is itself a product of natural evolution, not of a deity or the embodiment of a cosmic spirit. From an evolutionary standpoint, humanity has been constituted to intervene actively, consciously, and purposively into first nature with unparalleled effectiveness, and to alter it on a planetary scale. To denigrate this capacity is to deny the thrust of natural evolution itself toward organic complexity and subjectivity, the potentiality of first nature to actualize itself in self-conscious intellectuality. One may choose to argue that this thrust was predetermined with inexorable certainty as a result of a deity, or one may contend that it was strictly fortuitous, or one may claim, as I would, that there is a natural tendency toward greater complexity and subjectivity in first nature, arising from the very interactivity of matter, indeed a nisus towards self-consciousness. But what is decisive here is the compelling fact that humanity's natural capacity to consciously intervene into and act upon first nature has given rise to a second nature, a cultural, social, and political nature that today has all but absorbed first nature. There is no part of the world that has not been profoundly affected by human activity. Neither the remote vastness of Antarctica, nor the canyons of the ocean's depths. Even wilderness areas require protection from human intervention. Much that is designated as wilderness today has already been profoundly affected by human activity. Indeed, wilderness can be said to exist primarily as a result of a human decision to preserve it. Nearly all the non-human life forms that exist today are, like it or not, to some degree in human custody, and whether they are preserved in their wild lifeways depends largely on human attitudes and behavior. That second nature is the outcome of evolution in first nature, and can thereby be designated as natural, does not mean that second nature is necessarily creative or even fully conscious of itself in any evolutionary sense. Second nature is synonymous with society and human internal nature, both of which are undergoing evolution for better or worse. Although social evolution is grounded in, indeed phases out of, organic evolution, it is also profoundly different from organic evolution. Consciousness, will, alterable institutions, and the operation of economic forces and techniques may be deployed to enhance the organic world or carry it to the point of destruction. Second nature, as it exists today, is marked by monstrous attributes, notably hierarchy, class, the state, private property, and a competitive market economy that obliges economic rivals to grow at the expense of each other or perish. This ethical judgment, I may note, has meaning only if we assume that there is potentiality and self-directiveness in organic evolution toward greater subjectivity, consciousness, self-reflexivity. By inference, it is the responsibility of the most conscious of life forms, humanity, to be the voice of a mute nature and to act to intelligently foster organic evolution. If this tendency or nisus in organic evolution is denied, there is no reason why the human species, like other species, should not utilize its capacities to serve its own needs or attain its own self-realization at the expense of other life forms that impede its interests and desires. To denounce humanity for exploiting organic nature, degrading it, abusing it, and behaving anthropocentrically is simply an oblique way of acknowledging that second nature is the bearer of moral responsibilities that do not exist in the realm of first nature. It is to acknowledge that if all life forms have an intrinsic worth that should be respected, they have it only because human intellectual, moral, and aesthetic abilities have attributed it to them, abilities that no other life form possesses. It is only human beings that can even formulate the concept of intrinsic worth and endow it with ethical responsibility. The intrinsic worth of human beings is thus patently exceptional, indeed extraordinary. It is essential to emphasize that second nature is in fact an unfinished, indeed inadequate, development of nature as a whole. Hegel viewed human history as a slaughter bench. Hierarchy, class, the state, and the like are evidence, and by no means purely accidental evidence, of the unfulfilled potentialities of nature to actualize itself as a nature that is self-consciously creative. Humanity as it now exists is not nature rendered self-conscious. The future of the biosphere depends overwhelmingly on whether second nature can be transcended in a new system of social and organic conciliation, one that I would call free nature, a nature that would diminish the pain and suffering that exist in both first and second nature. Free nature, in effect, would be a conscious and ethical nature, an ecological society that I have explored in detail elsewhere. Beyond first and second nature. We must try to bring the threads of our discussion together and examine the important implications dialectic has for ecological thinking. A dialectical view of life is a special form of process philosophy. Its emphasis is not on change alone, but on development. It is inductive rather than merely deductive, mediated rather than merely processual, and cumulative rather than merely continuous. Its objectivity begins with the existence of the potential, not with the mere facticity of the real. Hence, its ethics seeks the what should be as a realm of objective possibilities. That possibilities are objective, albeit not in the sense of a simplistic materialism, is dialectically justified by the perception that potentiality and its latent possibilities form an existential continuum that constitutes the authentic world of truth. The world of the what should be, not simply the world of the what is, with all its incompleteness and falsehood. From a dialectical viewpoint, a change in a given level of biotic, communal, or for that matter, social organization, consists not simply of the appearance of a new, possibly more complex ensemble of feedback loops. Rather, it consists of qualitatively new attributes, interrelationships, and degrees of subjectivity that express and radically condition the emergence of a new potentiality, opening a new realm of possibility with its own unique tendency, not a greater or lesser number of fluctuations and rhythms. Moreover, this new potentiality is itself the result of other actualizations of potentialities that, taken together historically and cumulatively, constitute a developmental continuum, not a bullet shot from a pistol that explodes into being without a history of its own or a continuum of which it is part. Dialectical logic is an immanent logic of process, an ontological logic, not only a logic of concepts, categories, and symbols. This logic is emergent, in the sense that one speaks of the logic of events. Considered in terms of its emphasis on differentiation, this logic is provocatively concrete in its relationship to abstract generalizations. Hence, Hegel's seemingly paradoxical expression, concrete universal. Dialectic, thereby, overcomes Plato's dualistic separation of exemplary ideas from the phenomenal world of imperfect copies. Hence, its ethical thrust is literally structured, cumulatively as well as sequentially, in the concrete. Emerging from this superb ensemble is a world that is always ethically problematical, but also an ethics that is always objective, a recognition of selfhood and subjectivity that embodies non-human and human nature, and the development of metabolic self-maintenance to rational self-direction and innovation that locates the origins of reason within nature, not in a supramundane domain apart from nature. The social is thus wedded to the natural, and human reason is wedded to non-human subjectivity through processes that are richly mediated and graded in a shared continuum of development. This ecological interpretation of dialectic not only overcomes dualism, but moves through differentiation away from reductionism. Ecology cleanses the remarkable heritage of European organismic thought of the hard teleological predeterminations it acquired from Greek theology, the Platonistic denigration of physicality, and the Christian preoccupation with human inwardness as soul and a reverence for God. Only ecology can ventilate the dialectic as an orientation toward the objective world by rendering it coextensive with natural evolution, a possibility that arose in the last century with the appearance of evolutionary theory. As such, an ecological dialectic is not solely a way of thinking organically. It can be a source of meaning to natural evolution, of ethical meaning, not only rational meaning. To state this idea more provocatively, we cannot hope to find humanity's place in nature without knowing how it emerged from nature, with all its problems and possibilities. An ecological dialectic produces a creative paradox. Second nature in an ecological society would be the actualization of first nature's potentiality to achieve mind and truth. Human intellection in an ecological society would thus fold back upon the evolutionary continuum that exists in first nature. In this sense, and in this sense alone, second nature would thus become first nature rendered self-reflexive, a thinking nature that would know itself and could guide its own evolution, not an unthinking nature that sought its own balance through the dynamics of fluctuations and feedback that cause needless pain, suffering, and death. Although thought, society, and culture would retain their integrity, they would consciously express the abiding tendency within first nature to press itself toward the level of conscious self-directiveness. In a very real sense, an ecological society would be a transcendence of both first nature and second nature into a new domain of a free nature, a nature that in a truly rational humanity reached the level of conceptual thought. In short, a nature that would willfully and thinkingly cope with conflict, contingency, waste, and compulsion. In this new synthesis, where first and second nature are melded into a free, rational, and ethical nature, neither first nor second would lose its specificity and integrity. Humanity, far from diminishing the integrity of nature, would add the dimension of freedom, reason, and ethics to it, and raise evolution to a level of self-reflexivity that has always been latent in the emergence of the natural world. If we understand that human beings are indeed moral agents because natural evolution confers upon them a clear responsibility toward the natural world, we cannot emphasize their unique attributes too strongly. For it is this unique ability to think conceptually and feel a deep empathy for the world of life that it makes it possible for humanity to reverse the devastation it has inflicted on the biosphere and create a rational society. This implies not only that humanity, once it came into its own as the actualization of its potentialities, could be a rational expression of nature's creativity and fecundity, but that human intervention into natural processes could be as creative as natural evolution itself. This evolutionary and dialectical viewpoint, which derives the human species from nature as the embodiment of nature's own thrust towards self-reflexivity, changes the entire argument around competing rights between human and non-human lifeforms into an exploration of the ways in which human beings intervene into the biosphere. Whether humanity recognizes that an ecological society would be the fulfillment of a major tendency in natural evolution, or remains blind to its own humanity as a moral and ecological agent in nature, becomes a social problem that requires a social ecology. The self-effacing quietism and spirituality so rampant today afflict a sizable, highly privileged sector of Euro-American society. Human types so consumed by a so-called love of nature and life that they may well ignore the needless but very real suffering and pain that exist in nature and society alike. Ecologizing the dialectic. It is eminently natural for humanity to create a second nature from its evolution in first nature. By second nature, I mean the development of uniquely human culture, with a wide variety of institutionalized human communities, effective human techniques, richly symbolic languages, and carefully managed sources of nutriment. The real question, I submit, is not whether second nature parallels, opposes, or blandly participates in an egalitarian first nature. Rather, it is how second nature is derived from first nature. More specifically, in what ways did the highly graded and many-phased evolution from first nature into second give rise to social institutions, forms of interactions between people, and an interaction between first and second nature that, in the best of cases, enriches both and yields a second nature that has an evolutionary development of its own? The ecological crisis we face today is very much a crisis in the emergence of society out of biology, in the problems, the rise of hierarchy, domination, patriarchy, classes, and the state, that unfolded with this development, and in the liberatory pathways that provide an alternative to this warped history. The fact that first and second nature exist and can never be dualized into parallels or simplistically reduced to each other accounts, in great part, for my phrase social ecology. Additionally, social ecology has the special meaning that the ecological crisis that beleaguers us stems from a social crisis, a crisis that the crude biologism of deep ecology generally ignores. Still further, that the resolution of this social crisis can only be achieved by reorganizing society along rational lines imbued with an ecological philosophy and sensibility. An ecological dialectic would have to address the fact that Aristotle and Hegel did not work with an evolutionary theory of nature, but rather saw the natural world more as a scala naturae, a ladder of being, than a flowing continuum. An ecological dialectic introduces evolution into this tradition and replaces the notion of a scala naturae with a richly mediated continuum. Both thinkers were more profoundly influenced by Plato than their writings would seem to indicate, with the result that in the case of Hegel, we move within a realm of concepts more than history. However historical Hegel's dialectic invariably was. Hegel was strongly preoccupied with the idea of nature rather than with its existential details, although he honored this preoccupation in the breach. Finally, the overarching teleology of the two philosophers tends to subordinate the contingency, spontaneity, and creativity that mark natural phenomena. Hegel, with his strong theological bent, terminated the unfolding of the world in an absolute that encompasses it in an identity of subject and object. In an ecological dialectic, by contrast, there will be no terminality that could culminate in a God or an absolute. Actuality, to use Hegel's special term, is the most momentary culmination of maturity, so that the objectivity of the potential, which is crucial for an objective ethics, is subordinated to its actualization. Dialectic, let me emphasize, is not merely change, motion, or even process, all banal imputations to the contrary notwithstanding, nor can it be subsumed under process philosophy. Dialectic is developmental, not only change. It is derivation, not only motion. It is mediation, not mere process. And it is cumulative, not only continuous. That it is also change, motion, process, and a continuum tells us only part of its true content, but denied its immanent self-directiveness and its intellectual eduction of the potential into the actual. This so-called process philosophy, indeed this remarkable notion of causality, ceases to be dialectic. Instead, it becomes a mere husk that our current flock of eco-fadists can reduce to kinetics, dynamics, fluctuations, and feedback loops, the same mechanistic verbiage with which systems theory dresses itself up as developmental philosophy. As Hegel warned in the course of reducing the complexity of the dialectical process, knowledge has, quote, no other object than to draw out what is inward or implicit and thus to become objective, unquote. But if, quote, that which is implicit comes into existence, it certainly passes into change, yet it remains one and the same. The plant, for example, does not lose itself in mere indefinite change. From the germ, much is produced when at first nothing was to be seen, but the whole of what is brought forth, if not developed, is yet hidden and ideally contained within itself. The principle of this projection into existence is that the germ cannot remain merely implicit, but is impelled towards development, since it presents the contradiction of being only implicitly and yet not desiring to be so. Unquote. Thus, dialectic is not wayward motion, the mere kinetics of change. There is a rational end view, not one that is preordained to state this point from an ecological viewpoint rather than a theological one, but one that actualizes what is implicit in the potential. Every if-then proposition is premised not on any if that springs into one's head like a gambler's hunch. It posits a potentiality that has its ancestry in the dialectical processes that preceded it. In the organic world, the metabolic activity of the simplest lifeforms constitutes the sense of self-identity, however germinal, from which nature acquires a rudimentary subjectivity. Not only does this rudimentary subjectivity, which reductionism necessarily cannot encompass, derive from the metabolic process of self-maintenance, a process that defines any life form as a unique whole. It extends itself beyond self-maintenance to become a striving activity, not unlike the development from the vegetative to the animative that ultimately yields mind, will, and the potentiality for freedom. Conceived dialectically, organic evolution is, in a broad sense, subjective insofar as lifeforms begin to exercise choices in adapting to new environments, a conception that stands much at odds with the clearly definable fixity we blissfully call clear thinking. Systems theory enters into the reductionist tableau in a sinister way. By dissolving the subjective element in biological phenomena so that they can be treated as mathematical symbols, systems theory permits evolutionary interaction, subjective development, and even process itself to be taken over by the system, just as the individual, the family, and the community are destructured into the system, embodied by the economic corporation and the state. Life ceases to have subjectivity and becomes a mechanism in which the tendency of lifeforms toward ever greater elaboration is replaced with feedback loops, and their evolutionary antecedents with programmed information. A systems view of life literally conceives of life as a system, not only as fluctuations and cycles, mechanistic as these concepts are in themselves. Despite the external selective factors with which Darwinians describe evolution, the tendency of life toward a greater complexity of selfhood, a tendency that yields increasing degrees of subjectivity, constitutes the internal or immanent impulse of evolution toward growing self-awareness. This evolutionary dialectic constitutes the essence of life as a self-maintaining organism that bears the potential for the development of self-conscious organisms. Dialectic, in effect, is not merely a logic or a method that can be bounced around and applied promiscuously to a content. It has no handbook other than reason itself to guide those who seek to develop a dialectical sensibility. Dialectic can no more be applied to problems in engineering than can Einstein's general theory of relativity be applied to plumbing. These problems can be best resolved by conventional forms of logic, common sense, and the pragmatic knowledge acquired through experience. Dialectic can only explicate a rationally developmental phenomenon, just as systems theory can only explicate the workings of a fluctuating and cyclical system. The kind of verification that validates or invalidates the soundness of dialectical reasoning, in turn, must be developmental, not relatively static, or for that matter, fluctuating kinds of phenomena. Freed from its theological trappings, dialectic explains, with a power beyond that of any conventional logic, how the organic flow of first into second nature is a reworking of biological into social reality. Each phase or moment, pressed by its own internal logic into an antithetical and ultimately a more transcendent form, emerges as a more complex unity in diversity that encompasses its earlier moments even as it goes beyond them. Despite the imagery of strife that permeates the Hegelian version of this process, the ultimate point in the Hegelian Aufhebung is reconciliation, not the nihilism of pure negation. Moreover, norms, the actualization of the potential is into the ethical ought, are anchored in the objective reality of potentiality itself, not as it always is, to be sure, but as it should be, such that speculation becomes a valid account of reality in its truth. Hegel, I would argue, radically expanded the very concept of being in philosophy and in the real world to encompass the potential and its actualization into the rational what should be, not only as an existential what is. Dialectical speculation, despite Hegel's own view of the retrospective function of philosophy, thus is projective, in a sharply critical sense, quite unlike futurology, which dissolves the future by making it a mere extrapolation of the present. In its restless critique of reality, we can call dialectic a negative philosophy, in contrast, I should add, to Adorno's nihilism, or negative dialectics. By the same token, speculation is creative in that it ceaselessly contrasts the free, rational and moral actuality of what could be, which inheres in nature's thrust towards self-reflexivity, with the existential reality of what is. Speculation can ask why, not only how, the real has become the irrational, indeed the inhuman and anti-ecological, precisely because dialectic alone is capable of grounding an ecological ethics in the potential. That is, in its objective possibilities for the realization of reason and truth. This objectivization of possibilities, of potentiality continuous with its unrealized actualization, is the ground for a genuinely objective ethics, as distinguished from an ethical relativism subject to the waywardness of the opinion pole. An ecological dialectic, in effect, opens the way to an ethics that is rooted in the objectivity of the potential, not in the commandments of a deity or the eternality of a supra-mundane and transcendental so-called reality. Hence, The what should be is not only objective, it forms the objective critique of the given reality. Chapter 10. Reason and History. Introduction. The ecological society that Bookchin described in 1964 remains a constant social ideal over 3 decades of his writing, projecting a clear and steady image of an ecological society, integrating town and country, individual and community, technology and ethics, politics and economy. The communistic principles he attributed to organic society in 1982 remain pillars of the society he has always envisioned. Interdependence must replace hierarchy, and freedom must be defined not in opposition to first nature, but as latent within it. The legacy of freedom is one he cherishes even more fervently in the face of an ever more powerful legacy of domination. But other aspects of Bookchin's work have undergone notable change over the years, as do those of all thinkers who are engaged in the public realm over a long period of time, and who are alert to changes to take place there. Chastened by the emergence of eco-mysticism, primitivism, and biocentrism in the ecology and anarchist movements, Bookchin today is far less lavish in his praise of organic society than he was in 1982. In the face of primitivistic rejections of civilization as such, for example, he no longer puts the word civilization in quotation marks. On the contrary, he capitalizes it. In the face of general rejections of progress as such, he is careful to define the kind of progress he endorses, namely, that which is associated with cooperation and community and that represents a heightening of ethical standards. He would no longer associate the Promethean impulse with domination or the conquest of nature as he once did. Now he regards it as a laudable metaphor for aspirations to advance the human condition. His view of imagination, too, has undergone a shift, where once he extolled the cry, "Imagination to power," raised by the Parisian students in 1968 as a glowing vision of the aestheticization of personality and society. Now he warns that, in the absence of rational objective standards of behavior, imagination may be as demonic as it may be liberatory. Indeed, where he once wrote of an ecological society, he now writes more frequently of a rational society, which, in his view, presupposes sound ecological practices, without yielding to mysticism or other forms of supernaturalism. History, Civilization and Progress, written in 1994, is a critique of current philosophical tendencies that condemn history, civilization, and progress as inherently repressive. An ecological humanism, Bookchin says today, would perform the difficult work of disclosing what is rational in what is ordinarily called history, civilization, and progress, and giving this rational core its due, rather than merely repudiating history, civilization, and progress as such. Moreover, he now gives an enlarged meaning to the legacy of freedom. It means not only the particular events in the history of libertarian alternatives, but the gradual, if uneven unfolding of potentialities for freedom, self-consciousness, and cooperation in human society. In true dialectical fashion, this legacy, far from repudiating history, civilization, and progress, actively participates in them. The richness of Bookchin's late work is to create this new synthesis, to show how emancipatory ideas infuse history despite its bleakest and cruelest moments. The creation of an ecological society must itself constitute an advance toward civilization and progress, or it will not have been an endeavor worth making. History, civilization, and progress. Rarely have the concepts that literally define the best of Western culture, its notions of a meaningful history, a universal civilization, and the possibility of progress, been called so radically into question as they are today. In recent decades, both in the United States and abroad, the academy and the subculture of self-styled postmodernist intellectuals have nourished an entirely new ensemble of cultural conventions that stem from a corrosive social, political, and moral relativism. This ensemble encompasses a crude nominalism, pluralism, and skepticism, an extreme subjectivism, and even outright nihilism and anti-humanism in various combinations and permutations, sometimes of a thoroughly misanthropic nature. This relativistic ensemble is pitted against coherent thought as such, and against the principle of hope, to use Ernst Bloch's expression, that marked radical theory of the recent past. Such notions percolate from so-called radical academics into the general public, where they take the form of personalism, amoralism, and neo-primitivism. History, I wish to contend, is the rational content and continuity of events, with due regard for qualitative leaps, that are grounded in humanity's potentialities for freedom, self-consciousness, and cooperation in the self-formative development of increasingly libertarian forms of consociation. It is the rational infrastructure, so to speak, that coheres human actions and institutions over the past and the present in the direction of an emancipatory society and emancipated individual. That is to say, history is precisely what is rational in human development. It is what is rational, moreover, in the dialectical sense of the implicit that unfolds, expands, and begins in varying degrees through increasing differentiation to actualize humanity's very real potentialities for freedom, self-consciousness, and cooperation. It will immediately be objected that irrational events, unrelated to this actualization, explode upon us at all times, in all eras and cultures. But insofar as they defy rational interpretation, they remain precisely events, not history, however consequential their effects may be on the course of other events. Their impact may be very powerful, to be sure, but they are not dialectically rooted in humanity's potentialities for freedom, self-consciousness, and cooperation. They can be assembled into chronicles, the stuff out of which a Froissart constructed his large anecdotal histories, but not history in the sense I am describing. Events may even overtake history, so to speak, and ultimately submerge it in the irrational and the evil. But without an increasingly self-reflexive history, which present-day relativism threatens to extinguish, we would not even know that it had happened. If we deny that humanity has these potentialities for freedom, self-consciousness, and cooperation, conceived as one ensemble, then along with many self-styled so-called socialists and even former anarchists like Daniel Cohn-Bendit, we may well conclude that capitalism has won, as one disillusioned friend put it, that history has reached its terminus in bourgeois democracy, however tentative this terminus may actually be, and that rather than attempt to enlarge the realm of the rational and the free, we would do our best to ensconce ourselves in the lap of capitalism and make it as comfortable a resting place as possible for ourselves. As a mere adaptation to what exists, to the what is, such behavior is merely animalistic. Sociobiologists may even regard it as genetically unavoidable. But my critics need not be sociobiologists to observe that historical record exhibits a great deal of adaptation and worse, of irrationality and violence, of pleasure in the destruction of oneself and others, and to question my assertion that history is the unfolding of human potentialities for freedom, self-consciousness, and cooperation. Indeed, humans have engaged in destruction and luxuriated in real and imaginary cruelties toward one another that have produced hells on earth. They have created the monstrosities of Hitler's death camps and Stalin's gulags, not to speak of the mountains of skulls that Mongol and Tartar invaders of Eurasia left behind in distant centuries. But this record hardly supplants the dialectic of unfolding and maturing of potentialities in social development, nor is the capacity of humans to inflict cruelties on each other equivalent to their potentialities for freedom, self-consciousness, and cooperation. Here, capacities and human potentialities must be distinguished from each other. The human capacity for inflicting injury belongs to the realm of natural history, to what humans share with animals in the biological world, or first nature. First nature is the domain of survival or core feelings of pain and fear, and in that sense, our behavior remains animalistic, which is by no means altered with the emergence of social or second nature. Unknowing animals merely try to survive and adapt to one degree or another to the world in which they exist. By contrast, humans are animals of a very special kind. They are knowing animals. They have the intelligence to calculate and to devise, even in the service of needs that they share with non-human life forms. Human reason and knowledge have commonly served aims of self-preservation and self-maximization by the use of a formal logic or expediency, a logic that rulers have deployed for social control and the manipulation of society. These methods have their roots in the animal realm of simple means-ends choices to survive. But humans also have the capacity to deliberately inflict pain and fear, to use their reason for perverse passions, in order to coerce others, or merely for cruelty for its own sake. Only knowing animals, ironically capable of intelligent innovation, with the Schadenfreude to enjoy vicariously the torment of others, can inflict fear and pain in a coldly calculated or even passionate manner. The Foucauldian hypostasization of the body as the terrain of sadomasochistic pleasure can be easily elaborated into a metaphysical justification of violence, depending, to be sure, on what pleases a particular perpetrating ego. In this sense, human beings are too intelligent not to live in a rational society, not to live within institutions formed by reason and ethics that restrict their capacity for irrationality and violence. Insofar as they do not, humans remain dangerously wayward and unformed creatures with enormous powers of destruction as well as creation. Humanity may be a potentiality for evil, as one colleague has argued, but that over the course of social development, people have exhibited an explosive capacity to perpetrate the most appallingly evil acts does not mean that human potentiality is constituted to produce evil and a nihilistic destructiveness. The capacity of certain Germans to establish an Auschwitz, indeed the means and the goal to exterminate a whole people in a terrifyingly industrial manner, was inherent neither in Germany's development nor in the development of industrial rationalization as such. However anti-Semitic many Germans were over the previous 2 centuries, Eastern Europeans were equally or even more so. Ironically, industrial development in Western Europe may have done more to achieve Jewish juridical emancipation in the 19th and 20th centuries than all the Christian pieties that marked pre-industrial life during the Middle Ages. Indeed, evil may have a logic, that is to say, it may be explained. But most general accounts explain the evolution of evil in terms of adventitious evil acts and events, if this can be regarded as explanation at all. Hitler's takeover of Germany, made possible more by economic and political dislocations than by the racial views he espoused, was precisely a terrible event that cannot be explained in terms of any human potentiality for evil. The horror of Auschwitz lies almost as much in its inexplicability, in its appallingly extraordinary character, as in the monstrosities that the Nazis generally inflicted on European Jews. It is in this sense that Auschwitz remains hauntingly inhuman, and that it has tragically produced an abiding mistrust by many people of civilization and progress. When explanations of evil are not merely narrations of events, they explain evil in terms of instrumental or conventional logic. The knowing animal, the human being, who is viciously harmful, does not use the developmental reason of dialectic, the reason of ethical reflection, nor a coherent reflective reason grounded in a knowledge of history and civilization, nor even the knowing of an ambiguous, arbitrary, self-generated imaginary, or a morality of personal taste and pleasure. Rather, the knowing animal uses instrumental calculation to serve evil ends, including the infliction of pain. The very existence of irrationalism and evil in many social phenomena today compels us to uphold a clear standard of the rational and the good by which to judge the one against the other. A purely personalistic, relativistic, or functional approach will hardly do for establishing ethical standards, as many critiques of subjectivism and subjective reason have shown. The personal tastes from which subjectivism and relativism derive their ethical standards are as transient and fleeting as moods. Nor will a nominalistic approach suffice. To reduce history to an incomprehensible assortment of patterns or to inexplicable products of the imagination is to deny social development in all internal ethical coherence. Indeed, an unsorted, ungraded, unmediated approach reduces our understanding of history to a crude eclecticism rather than an insightful coherence, to an overemphasis on differentia, so easy to do these mindless days, and on the idiosyncratic rather than on the meaningful and the universal, more often attracting the commonsensical individual to the psychoanalytical couch than helping him or her reconstitute a left libertarian social movement. If our views of social development are to be structured around the differences that distinguish one culture or period from another, we will ignore underlying tendencies that, with extraordinary universality, have greatly expanded the material and cultural conditions for freedom on various levels of individual and social self-understanding. By grossly emphasizing disjunctions, social isolates, unique configurations, and chance events, we will reduce shared, clearly common social developments to an archipelago of cultures, each essentially unrelated to those that preceded and followed it. Yet many historical forces have emerged, declined, and emerged again, despite the formidable obstacles that often seem to stand in their way. One does not have to explain everything in foundational terms to recognize the existence of abiding problems such as scarcity, exploitation, class rule, domination, and hierarchy that have agonized oppressed peoples for thousands of years. If critics were correct in dubbing dialectic a mystery for claiming to encompass all phenomena by a few cosmic formulas, then they would be obliged to regard human social development as a mystery if they claimed that it lacks any continuity and unity, that is, the bases for a philosophy of history. Without a notion of continuity in history, how could we explain the extraordinary efflorescence of culture and technique that Homo sapiens produced during the Magdalenian period, or 20 or 30,000 years ago? How could we explain the clearly unrelated evolution of complex agricultural systems in at least 3 separate parts of the world, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and Mesoamerica, that apparently had no contact with one another, and that were based on the cultivation of very different grains, notably wheat, rice, and maize? How could we explain the great gathering of social forces in which, after 10,000 years of arising, stagnating, and disappearing, cities finally gained control over the agrarian world that had impeded their development, yielding the urban revolution, as V. Gordon Childe called it, in zones of the world that could have no contact with one another? Mesoamerica and Mesopotamia, most clearly, could not have had any contact with each other since Paleolithic times, yet their agriculture, towns and cities, literacy, and mathematics developed in ways that are remarkably similar. Initially Paleolithic foragers, both cultures ultimately produced highly urbanized cultures based on grain cultivation, glyphs, accurate calendaries, and very elaborate pottery, to cite only the most striking parallels. The wheel was known to Mesoamericans, although they do not seem to have used it, probably for want of some appropriate draft animals, as well as the zero, despite the absence of any communication with Eurasian societies. It requires an astonishing disregard for the unity of civilization on the part of historical relativists to emphasize often minor differences, such as clothing, some daily customs, and myths, at the expense of a remarkable unity of consciousness and social development that the two cultures exhibited on 2 separate continents after many millennia of isolation from each other. Caprice, accident, irrationality, and imaginaries certainly enter into social development for better or worse, but they have no meaning if there is no ethical standard by which to define the other of what we are presupposing with our standard. Seemingly accidental or eccentric factors must be raised to the level of social theory rather than be shriveled to the level of nominalistic minutiae if we are to understand them. Despite the accidents, failures, and other aberrations that can alter the course of rational, social, and individual development, there is a legacy of freedom, as I have named a key chapter in my book, The Ecology of Freedom, a tradition of increasing approximation of humanity toward freedom and self-consciousness, in ideas and moral values, and the overall terrain of social life. Indeed, the existence of history as a coherent unfolding of real emancipatory potentialities is clearly verified by the existence of civilization, the potentialities of history embodied and partially actualized. It consists of the concrete advances, material as well as cultural and psychological, that humanity has made toward greater degrees of freedom, self-consciousness, and cooperation, as well as rationality itself. To have transcended the limitations of the kinship tie, to have gone beyond mere foraging into agriculture and industry, to have replaced the parochial band or tribe with the increasingly universal city, to have devised writing produced literature and developed richer forms of expression than non-literate peoples could have ever imagined. All of these and many more advances have provided the conditions for evolving increasingly sophisticated notions of individuality and expanding notions of reason that remain stunning achievements to this very day. It is dialectical reason, rather than conventional reason, that apprehends the development of this tradition. Indeed, dialectical logic can hardly be treated co-equally with eruptions of brutality, however calculated they may be, since in no sense can episodic capacities be equated with an unfolding potentiality. A dialectical understanding of history apprehends differentia in quality, logical continuity, and maturation in historical development, as distinguished from the kinetics of mere change or simple directivity of social dynamics, rarefying projects for human liberation, without relevance to the realities of the overall human experience and the insights of speculative reason, can cause us to overlook the existential impact of these developments and the promise they hold for ever greater freedom, self-consciousness, and cooperation. We take these achievements all too easily for granted without asking what kind of human beings we could be if they had not occurred as a result of historical and cultural movements more fundamental than eccentric factors. These achievements, let us acknowledge quite clearly, are civilization, indeed a civilizing continuum that is nonetheless infused by terribly barbaric, indeed animalistic features. The civilizing process has been ambiguous, as I have emphasized in my Ambiguities of Freedom, but it has nonetheless historically turned folk into citizens, while the process of environmental adaptation that humans share with animals has been transformed into a wide-ranging, strictly human process of innovation in distinctly alterable environments. It is a process that reached its greatest universality primarily in Europe, however much other parts of the world have fed into the experience. Those of us who understandably fear that the barrier between civilization and chaos is fragile actually presuppose the existence of civilization, not simply of chaos, and the existence of rational coherence, not simply of irrational incoherence. Moreover, the dialectic of freedom has emerged again and again in recurring struggles for freedom, ideological as well as physical, that have abidingly expanded overall goals of freedom, self-consciousness, and cooperation, as much in social evolution as a whole as within specific temporal periods. The past is replete with instances in which masses of people, however disparate their cultures, have tried to resolve the same millennia-old problems in remarkably similar ways and with remarkably similar views. The famous cry for equality that the English peasants raised in their 1381 revolt, when Adam delved and Eve span who was then the gentleman, is as meaningful for contemporary revolts as it was 600 years ago in a world that presumably had a far different imaginary from our own. The denial of a rational universal history of civilization, of progress, and of social continuity renders any historical perspective impossible, and hence any revolutionary praxis meaningless except as a matter of personal, indeed often very personal, taste. Even as social movements attempt to attain what they might call a rational society, in developing humanity's potentialities for freedom, self-consciousness and cooperation, history may constitute itself as an ever-developing whole. This whole, I should emphasize, must be distinguished from a terminal Hegelian absolute, just as demands for coherence in a body of views must be distinguished from the worship of such an absolute, and just as the capacity of speculative reason to educe, in a dialectically logical manner, the very real potentialities for humanity, for freedom, is neither teleological nor absolutist, much less totalitarian. Wholeness is no teleological referent, whose evolving components are merely parts of a predetermined absolute. Neither the rational unfolding of human potentialities, nor their actualization in an eternally given totality is predestined. Nor is the working out of our potentialities some vague sort of suprahuman activity. Human beings are not the passive tools of a spirit, Geist, that works out its complete and final self-realization and self-consciousness. Rather, they are active agents, the authentic constituents of history, who may or may not elaborate their potentialities in social evolution. Aborted the revolutionary tradition has been here, and discontinuous it has been there. And for all we know, it may ultimately be aborted for humanity as such. Whether an ultimate rational society will even exist as a liberatory end of history is beyond anyone's predictive powers. We cannot say that the scope of a rational, free, and cooperative society, we cannot say what the scope of a rational, free, and cooperative society would be, let alone presume to claim knowledge of its limits. Indeed, insofar as the historical process effected by living human agents is likely to expand our notions of the rational, the democratic, the free, and the cooperative, it is undesirable to dogmatically assert that they have any finality. History forms its own ideal of these notions at various times, which in turn have been expanded and enriched. Every society has the possibility of attaining a remarkable degree of rationality, given the material, cultural, and intellectual conditions that allow for it, or at least are available to it. Within the limits of a slave, patriarchal, warrior, and urban world, for example, the ancient Athenian polis functioned more rationally than Sparta or other Greek polis. It is precisely the task of speculative reason to adduce what should exist at any given period, based on the very real potentialities for the expansion of these notions. To conclude that the end of history has been attained in liberal capitalism would be to jettison the historical legacy of these magnificent efforts to create a free society. Efforts that claimed countless lives in the great revolutions of the past. For my part, I and probably many revolutionaries today want no place in such an end of history. Nor do I want to forget the great emancipatory movements for popular freedom in all their many forms that occurred over the ages. History, civilization, and progress are the dialectically rational social dispensations that form, even with all the impediments they face, a dialectical legacy of freedom. The existence of this legacy of freedom in no way denies the existence of a legacy of domination, which remains within the realm of the irrational. Indeed, these legacies intertwine with and condition each other. Human ideals, struggles, and achievements of various approximations to freedom cannot be separated from the cruelties and barbarities that have marked social development over the centuries, often giving rise to new social configurations whose development is highly unpredictable. But a crucial historical problematic remains, to the extent that reason can foresee a given development. Will it be freedom or domination that is nourished? I submit that progress is the advance, and as everyone presumably hopes, the ascendancy of freedom over domination, which clearly cannot be conceptually frozen in an ahistorical eternity, given the growing awareness of both hopes and oppressions that have come to light in only a few generations ago. Progress also appears in the overall improvement, however ambiguous, of humanity's material conditions of life. The emergence of a rational ethics with enlightened standards of sensibility and conduct out of unreflexive custom and theistic morality and social institutions that foster continual self-development and cooperation. However lacking our ethical claims in relation to social practice may be, given all the barbarities of our time, we now subject brutality to much harsher judgments than was done in earlier times. It is difficult to conceive of a rational ethics, as distinguished from unthinking custom and mere commandments of morality, like the Decalogue, without reasoned criteria of good and evil based on real potentialities for freedom that speculative reason can deduce beyond a given reality. The sufficient conditions for an ethics must be explicated rationally, not simply affirmed in public opinion polls, plebiscites, or an intersubjective consensus that fails to clarify what constitutes subjectivity and autonomy. Admittedly, this is not easy to do in a world that celebrates vaporous words, but it is necessary to discover truth rather than work with notions that stem from the conventional so-called wisdom of our times. As Hegel insisted, even commonplace moral maxims like "love thy neighbor as thyself" raise many problems, such as what we really mean by love. Minimally, the actualization of humanity's potentialities consists in its attainment of a rational society. Such a society, of course, would not appear ab novo. By its very nature, it would require development, maturation, or more precisely, a history. A rational development that may be fulfilled by the very fact that the society is potentially constituted to be rational. If the self-realization of life in a non-human world is survival or stability, the self-realization of humanity is the degree of freedom, self-consciousness and cooperation, as well as rationality in society. Reduced merely or primarily to scientific natural law, objectivity is highly attenuated. It does not encompass potentiality and the working of the dialectic in existential reality, let alone its presence as a standard for gauging reality against actuality in the unfolding of human phenomena. Today, when subjectivism reigns supreme, and the common response even to significant events is to erase any meaning and coherence from history, civilization and progress, there is a desperate need for an objectivity that is immensely broader than natural science and natural laws on the one hand, and an emphasis on the idiosyncratic, imaginary, and adventitious on the other. If vulgar Marxists used science to turn the ethical claim that socialism is necessary into the teleological assertion that socialism is inevitable, today's post-Marxist critics repeat a similar vulgarity by mordantly celebrating incoherence in the realm of social theory. The claim of socialism's inevitability was crudely deterministic. The claim of its necessity was a rational and ethical explication. Dialectic, it should be emphasized, cannot be reduced merely to a method on the grounds that such disparate dialectical thinkers as Aristotle, John Scotus Ira-Jenner, Hegel, and Marx comprehended different realms of knowledge and reality in different ways and periods. Humanity's knowledge of dialectic has itself been a process, and dialectical thinking has itself undergone development, a cumulative development, not a so-called paradigm shift, just as scientists have been obliged in the give and take or sublation of ideas to resolve one-sided insights into the nature of reality and its becoming. Although the broader objectivity that dialectical reasoning educes does not dictate that reason will prevail, it implies that it should prevail, thereby melding ethics with human activity and creating the basis for a truly objective ethical socialism or anarchism. As such, Dialectic is not simply an ontological causality. It is also an ethics, an aspect of dialectical philosophy that has not been sufficiently emphasized. Dialectical reason permits an ethics in history by upholding the rational influence of what should be against what is. History, qua the dialectically rational, exercises a pressing claim, so to speak, on our canons of behavior and our interpretation of events. Without this liberatory legacy and the human practice that fosters its unfolding, we have absolutely no basis for even judging what is creative or stagnant, rational or irrational, or good or evil in any constellation of cultural phenomena other than personal preference. Unlike science's limited objectivity, dialectical naturalism's objectivity is ethical by its very nature, by virtue of the kind of society it identifies as rational, a society that is the actualization of humanity's potentialities. It sublates science's narrow objectivity to advance by rational inferences drawn from the objective nature of human potentialities, a society that increasingly actualizes those potentialities, and it does so on the basis of what should be as the fulfillment of the rational, on rational knowledge of the good, and a conceptual congruence between the good and the socially rational that can be embodied in free institutions. It is not that social development is dialectical because it is necessarily rational, as a traditional Hegelian might suppose, but rather that where social development is rational, it is dialectical or historical. In short, we can educe from a uniquely human potentiality a rational development that advances human self-realization in a free, self-conscious and cooperative society. Speculative reason here stakes out a claim to discern the rational development, by no means immune to irrational vicissitudes, of society as it should be, given human potentiality as we know it in real life, to evolve from a tribal folk to a democratic citizenry, from mythopoesis to reason, and the submission of personhood in a folklore collectivity to individuality in a rational community, all as rational ends as well as existential realities. Speculative reason should always be called upon to understand and explain not only what has happened with respect to these problematics, but why they recur in varying degrees and how they can be resolved. In a very real sense, the past 15 or more years have been remarkably ahistorical, albeit highly eventful, insofar as they have not been marked by any lasting advance toward a rational society. Indeed, if anything, they would seem to be tilting toward a regression, ideologically and structurally, to barbarism, despite spectacular advances in technology and science, whose outcome we cannot foresee. There cannot be a dialectic, however, that deals dialectically with the irrational, with regression into barbarism, that is to say, a strictly negative dialectics. Both Adorno's book of that name, and Horkheimer and Adorno's The Dialectic of Enlightenment, which traced the dialectical descent of reason, in Hegel's sense, into instrumentalism, were little more than mixed farragos of convoluted neo-Nietzschean verbiage, often brilliant, colourful, and excitingly informative, but often confused, rather dehumanizing, and, to speak bluntly, irrational. A dialectic that lacks any spirit of transcendence and denies the negation of negation is spurious at its very core. Stated bluntly, no revolutionary movement can grow if its theorists essentially deny Bloch's principle of hope, which the movement so needs for an inspired belief in the future. If it denies universal history that affirms sweeping common problems that have besieged humanity over the ages, if it denies the shared interests that give a movement of the basis for a common struggle in achieving a rational dispensation of social affairs, if it denies a processual rationality and a growing idea of the good based on more than personalistic or intersubjective and consensual grounds, if it denies the powerful civilizatory dimensions of social development, ironically, dimensions that are in fact so useful to contemporary nihilists in criticizing humanity's failings, and if it denies historical progress. Yet, in present-day theoretics, a series of events replaced history. Cultural relativism replaces civilization, and the basic pessimism replaces a belief in the possibility of progress. What is more sinister? Mythopoesis replaces reason, and dystopia, the prospect of a rational society. What is at stake in these displacements is an intellectual and practical regression of appalling proportions, an especially alarming development today when theoretical clarity is of the utmost necessity. What our times require is a social analysis that calls for a revolutionary and ultimately popular movement, not a psychoanalysis that issues self-righteous disclaimers for beautiful souls, ideologically dressed in cloaks of personal virtue. Given the disparity between what rationally should be and what currently exists, reason may not necessarily become embodied in a free society. If and when the realm of freedom ever does reach its most expansive form, to the extent that we can envision it, and if hierarchy, classist domination, and the exploitation were ever abolished, we would be obliged to enter that realm only as free beings, as truly rational, ethical, and empathetic knowing animals, with the highest intellectual insight and ethical probity, not as brutes coerced into it by grim necessity and fear. The riddle of our times is whether today's relativists would have equipped us intellectually and ethically to cross into that most expansive realm of freedom. We cannot merely be driven into greater freedom by blind forces that we fail to understand, as Marxists implied, still less by mere preferences that have no standing in anything more than imaginary instincts or libidinal desires. The relativists of our time could actually play a sinister role if they permitted the imaginative to loosen our contact with the objective world. For in the absence of rational, objective standards of behavior, imagination may be as demonic as it may be liberatory when such standards exist. Hence the need for informed spontaneity and an informed imagination. The exhilarating events of May to June 1968, with the cry, "Imagination to Power," were followed a few years later by a surge in the popularity of nihilistic postmodernism and post-structuralism in the academy, an unsavory metaphysics of desire, and an apolitical call for imagination, nourished by a yearning for self-realization. More than ever, I would insist, we must invert Nietzsche's dictum, "all facts are interpretations," and demand that all interpretations be rooted in objectivity. We must seek out broader interpretations of socialism than those that cast socialist ideals as a science and strangled its movements in authoritarian institutions. At a time when we teeter between civilization and barbarism, the current apostles of irrationality in all their varied forms are the chthonic demons of a dark world who have come to life not to explicate humanity's problems, but to effect a dispiriting denial of the role of rationality in history and human affairs. My disquiet today lies not in the absence of scientific guarantees that a libertarian socialist society will appear, one that at my age it will never be my privilege to see, but in whether it will even be fought for in so decadent and desperate a period.